In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee. Be happily unto through Christ our Lord. Amen. Mary, help of Christians, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Yesterday we talked a little bit about the structure and nature of diabolic influence in general, and today we want to actually talk about how it actually applies to marriage. Because there's very specific things that the demons actually do. There's a very specific kinds of attacks that they actually do in order to bring the marriage down. Every marriage is usually subject to some kinds of attacks, and it usually depends. I'm always nervous when you get these couples who, I just love him to death. There's just no problems in our marriage. And then he is like, I just love her to death. There's just no problems in our marriage. I'm like, somebody's not seeing something, usually is what's going on there. Part of the difficulty, of course, too, is that after original sin, marriage was affected because the relationship of men and women was fundamentally affected because of the sin of Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve committed their sins, it actually affected them in different ways, which we'll see, because one is called the curse of Eve. Women got stuck with very specific problems because of Eve's sin. Men got stuck with another set of different set of problems, as well as the general problems of original sin. But one of those is the temporal punishment due to sin of demons affecting us. And that also means that the demons will use those defects of original sin against the married couple. And this is something that they have to be aware of. This is one of the reasons why knowledge of the Catholic faith is very important. It's not helpful for people just to be ignorant in general. Okay. So we want to start out first with what the general kind of principles that you need to observe when you're looking at how demons affect marriage. And the first and foremost thing to keep in mind is that the foundation of all division and strife within the marriage is always based on this one principle. And that is the first thing that the demons always do is divide the couple internally, that is in their own minds, by affecting their perceptions of each other. That's always the first thing they do. You can't separate people physically or externally, normally speaking, until you first divide them psychologically from each other. And so the first thing they do is they try and foster a negative attitude towards the spouse, and they're constantly affecting the perceptions. So let me give you an example. Very often, you'll see something similar along these lines. The wife decides she's going to do something for the husband because it's his birthday. Now, he's in bed, and it's till 7 o'clock in the morning, and she goes in because she wants to make him breakfast in bed, and she says to him, when are you getting up? And the reason she's asking this is in order to plan it so that when he's ready to get up, the breakfast is ready. But when he hears her say, when are you getting up, the demon steps in, puts in his mind, which, by the way, has been fostered for years usually. When people first get married, you know, they just, isn't she so wonderful? And then after 5 years, that old battle axe, right? And that's because over the course of time, they've had a narrative experience, but also, so there's legitimate psychological reasons why people can kind of divide, but there's also the demons themselves step in and say, see, she thinks you're lazy. She's wanting to know what time you're getting out of bed because you should be out of bed already. She thinks you should be out of bed and you're lazy. When all she was trying to do is an act of charity. In our community that we're trying to start, we have a general principle, which is any negative thought against any other community members is to be ignored. And if it's something that you think needs to be addressed, you go and you air it out immediately to the other individual in the community. We have found that 95% of the time, the negative judgment was baseless. When that happens, it doesn't happen too often because we kind of know how the structure of this stuff works. We know that the demons will literally put on your minds. Like, one of the things as a superior is that's always floating through my mind, and when I return is, oh, but they didn't get this done or this done or this done, and I show up and it's all done. Right? And what that's a sign of is the fact that they're actually trying to affect your perceptions about it, because that's the first place they have to divide you. So within the marriage, the first way you're going to protect your marriage from demons is not allowing them to affect your perceptions. I'm not saying you be an ostrich and stick your head in the sand about your partner's defects. In fact, one of the things that God does is he makes sure you get hooked up with the person who maximizes the sensitivity to your own defects. right? And the way we see this is I've always had a problem with X, and then I married a husband, and that is his problem. Of course it is. That's exactly why God has them there. In fact, most people don't realize is that your spouse there is primarily there to chisel away at your defects. And it's interesting how God will give people a grace to see the defect of the spouse. And here I'm not even talking about necessarily that it's a jaded perception, because most of the time I think it is. People have a very jaded perception of their spouses very often after a little bit of time, and there's no recognition that in most cases of marriage, at least to people who are Catholic, there is goodwill. But the demons use a very specific mechanism, and that is the closer we are to somebody, the less protected we are internally, emotionally, in relationship to them. Because we're putting ourselves out there, right? Even the very process of dating, the guy has to go and ask the woman into court, and if that's going to happen, he's kind of sticking his heart out there, he's holding it to her, and he's just waiting to see whether she's going to accept his heart or she's just going to go crunch, right? It's the same thing within marriage. Because to have a normal intimacy within marriage or even within family, you don't put up the wall between the two of you, because the very nature of marriage is to have union, and so that wall has to come down, but that also means you're vulnerable in relationship to the other individual. And so the fact that spouses do things means that it's very easy to get hurt in that process. It's just the structure of it. But that means that most spouses don't have a willingness to suffer. But it also means that they're not looking at it necessarily, they're looking at it from their own emotional hurt point of view, or their own woundedness, rather than what was the spouse really intending. In other words, even in marriage, the relationship you have with the other individual has to be rooted in what is objectively the reality. What did your spouse really want? What you feel, I hate to say this, but what you feel is absolutely and utterly irrelevant. Say that again. The biggest mistake people make today is they take their emotions and they look through their marriage through the prism of their emotions, and all that does is provide the demons with the fodder, because the demons have access to the emotions, and so they can constantly foster that. That means the first thing you have to do in marriage, if you're going to get to any semblance of solid foundation, is you have to put aside how you feel in relationship to the individual to see what is the objective reality. And most of the time, most spouses will admit he didn't mean to hurt me, or she didn't mean to really hurt me in that particular case. And so really, I just have to put that aside regardless of how I feel. But the demons are going to be picking at that. And once the woundedness happens in relationship to the marriage, that pain in relationship to the wounds, the demons will pick and pick and pick and pick at it. That's why you absolutely, positively, in fact, usually when I'm doing marriage prep, one of the first things I'll do, or when I'm doing marriage counseling, is the first thing you have to do is you have to divide the combatants. Okay, you go to your corner and you go to your corner, right? Quit doing, which is one of the things that the demons will do, is they quit focusing on what you perceive is the problem of your spouse. You have to stop that. Because that's exactly what the demons are doing. See, he doesn't love you. See, if he did this, if he really loved you, he wouldn't do this. Look at how obnoxious he is that he leaves his socks on the floor, or whatever, right? Rather than looking at it as, hey, it's my opportunity to grow in detachment and lack of self-will and working on my duty and state in life, etc. There's a constant shift in the focus towards focusing on the negative of the spouse, and that's a sign that the demons have got involved. So the first thing you have to do is, okay, you go to the corner, you go to your corner. Second, you have to heal individually before you're going to be able to come together and have a normal marriage, because the demons, again, are going to be using the woundedness. This is one of the reasons why I tell people before, part of the reason for courtship is to determine, A, if the person has sufficient virtue, but that also means that they're not wounded, because a lot of people are very wounded individuals, or they have a very tender heart towards each other. But having a tender heart is a good thing. Our Lord and Our Lady had the most tender of all hearts. But if you don't have that perfection that they had, which is that ability to suffer well, then you're not going to be willing to be vulnerable in relationship to your spouse. And as a result of that, the wall is going to come up and the division is going to be there, and the demons are going to start building the wall block by block by constantly putting stuff in your head about your spouse. They're going to constantly be working on that. That particular aspect, and we're going to talk about what those individual blocks and bricks are, because there's specific things they're going to use against them, and a lot of it is based on just gross ignorance of the Catholic faith in relationship to the obligations of the spouse, etc. There's also a very common, so that's one of the things that demons are going to do, is constantly, by affecting your perception of them, they're going to try and get you hyper-focused on the injustice that occurs in relationship to the other spouse, when half the time it's in your head. I hate to say that, but most of the time the spouse is, he said X. Well, X is true. Yeah, but it hurt my feelings. And your point is? The point is that you have to be willing to put your emotions aside and focus on that, because if you don't, the demons are going to use that against you. One of the other things is that demons will do, and these are just kind of general things first before we get to the specifics, demons will very often make sure that one of the spouse is a slacker, usually in the area of the spiritual life. They'll always try and make one of them tepid, while the other one is really trying to advance in spiritual life. They'll really drive one of the spouses in order to be tepid spiritually and not have an interest in the spiritual life, in order to bring the other spouse, who is actually interested in the spiritual life, down. The number of spouses that actually both are actively on the same level, striving for, and the same level of desire to strive for sanctified perfection, is extraordinarily rare. And I'll admit, it's usually the guys that are the slackers in the spiritual life. That's usually where you tend to see it. And that's because of the fact that they get them focused on other things, their duties of their state in life or what have you. And that's why they get their focus. As I mentioned yesterday, there's a general principle among the demons: anything but God. Anything but God. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's not God. And even if it's your duties of state in life, even if it's doing the right thing by your spouse, as long as they get you hyper-focused on that and you're not doing it for God's sake or keeping God at the forefront, they've won. And so this is one of the reasons why you have to constantly be practicing recollection, even within the home. One of the things that demons will do within the home is just fill it with noise and bustling, unnecessary activity. If it's necessary, it's another matter, especially when you got a big family. People will very often go over to people's family and say, "Father, sorry this is such a mess, and sorry it's so much chaotic." And I said, I grew up in a big family. I know what chaos is. So, in fact, I recently heard recordings that were made of me when I was 7 or 8 years old. And when I read that, listened to it, I'm like, man, I can't believe how obnoxious I was. All right. But the point being is that they're going to try and proliferate everything that distracts the family from God and from the spouses from focusing on God. Okay. But this means that if your spouse is a slacker, that just means that you have to be willing to do your part in order to help the person come up to speed, not beat them over the head. The first thing that, again, part of what the demons are trying to do is replicate hell in this world. That's their goal. That's what they're trying to do. And part of that comes by having the kinds of relationships that they have with each other, which is what? They just beat on each other all the time. There's no capacity to love, or even when they help each other out, it's only for their own self-interest. And so even when they're done, they're like there's a certain demographic in our culture. It doesn't matter what good things you do to you, they never thank you, right? Well, it's the same thing that you'll see here, and that's one of the things we're trying to do within marriage. Our Lady said at Quito that the Freemasons, which by the way is a thoroughly diabolic institution, thoroughly from the bottom to the top. Now, I'm not suggesting that the people at the bottom actually are Satanists, but when you get to the top, there's a shift that's actually happening culturally. Historically, it was Luciferian, which is different from Satanic. Luciferian is you become your own god. Or that's generally what the Freemasons were at the top levels. But now what's happening is there's a slow shift that's actually occurring among the Freemasons, where it's actually becoming satanic, openly satanic at the top. Okay. But they said they were going to, Our Lady said at Quito, they were going to attack marriage during the time we're living in. And they've done a phenomenal job with divorce, etc., and everything that they're doing. Most people don't know this, but the ones who started the swing culture in this country were actually the Freemasons. The ones that are backing all of the gay marriage and stuff like that are the Freemasons, in addition to other people. But they're the ones pushing for this because they're trying to destroy marriage. It just means that they're the instrument. It's the demons who are really after the destruction of marriage. Why? Because marriage is the foundation of culture. If you can destroy marriage, you can destroy the culture. If you can destroy the relationship that the husband and the wife have together, you'll destroy the moral and spiritual formation of the children. So they understand the structure better than we do, and they know exactly where to attack it. So we want to go into the various areas that they actually attack marriage. So that's what we're going to do. You can keep track of your questions. At the end of the third conference, we'll have about 40 minutes for people to ask questions. Okay. The first is that the demons are actually attacking the very definition of marriage. The very definition of marriage. Marriage is defined as a solemn contract, not a covenant. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. It's a solemn contract in which a man and a woman, not Adam and Steve, it was Adam and Eve, confer bodily rights for the sake of having children. That's the formal ecclesiastical definition of marriage. A solemn contract in which a man and a woman confer bodily rights. What's happened in relationship to the discussion of a contract, it's a solemn contract because it's solemnized in front of, it's public, at a church, in front of a public minister of the church. So that's what makes it solemn. It's a contract because there's a conferral of bodily rights. Can it be called a covenant? Yes and no. It depends on what you mean by that. A covenant, if you look up a covenant in the traditional dictionaries, not the stuff that's happened after Vatican II, but the traditional dictionaries, they simply define covenant as a solemn contract. It's an actual contract. Why is it important? Because after Vatican II, there was a shift in looking at marriage from the point of view of everything other than the obligations of justice within the marriage. And so now you have this problem, it was a very subtle things that the demons did to get people focused on all the ancillary things other than what justice actually requires. It's a contract. It's no different from if I'm contracting somebody to mow my lawn, although there's a little bit of difference, obviously. But there is an actual agreement. You do X, I do Y. And it's a solemn contract. So can you call it a covenant? Yes, if by covenant you understand a solemn contract, and a covenant can actually add certain dimension to it, which is a perfectly legitimate theological discussion, as long as it's understood that the foundational aspect of it is an actual contract. There's a slow beginning discussions among some of the theologians of, we need to really discuss this contractual issue again because there's other issues that are rising. Okay. So this contract means that they have bodily rights over each other. It is a legal, that is a natural law, contract, which binds the two parties gravely, which means if you fail to fulfill certain parts of the contract, you commit mortal sin. It's that simple. And this is why the demons are working on it. The demons have this general principle. If they can't get you to fall subjectively, they'll get you to objectively offend God because really their beef is with God. Although once in a while their beef is with us too. One time I was dealing with Beelzebub and he just says, I hate your guts. And I said, no, you don't hate me, you hate him. He says, oh, I hate him, but I hate you too. Okay, fair enough. All right. So, but the point is that they'll try and get people to objectively offend God by doing these things when they don't know. Okay. So it's a legal contract. The foundation is a natural law structure, institution that God established through the natural law with a sacrament layered on top of it. That's the nature of marriage. The tradition is absolutely clear that one must render the marital debt, that is, if one of the spouses reasonably asks for the conjugal act, it must be rendered, if it's reasonable, it must be rendered, otherwise it's mortally sinful to deny that request. So if you look at Prumer, who was kind of a moralist before, he was one of the best moralists before Vatican II, but you can find it in pretty much any moralist, he says, as often as the other spouse reasonably and seriously seeks the conjugal debt, sometimes called the marital debt, the other spouse is held out of justice to render it, and indeed under the pain of mortal sin. This has been the teaching of the church from the beginning until now. This is one of the reasons why St. Paul says, be subject to one another. Now, in another place he says, wives, be subject to your husbands, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But they have to be subject to each other. The demons suggest to people various things which make them think they have sufficient reason to deny the marital debt. You know, he's not being romantic, therefore you can deny the marital debt. Or they tend to think that rendering the marital debt after marriage is something that's voluntary. Well, in a certain sense it is, because you have to choose to actually fulfill your obligations. But it's not voluntary in the sense that after you're married, that somehow or another it's at your discretion when you pass out this goodie, so to speak. So that in point in fact, you'll hear the phrase gift of self. Now, that phrase can actually have a legitimate meaning. Gift means it's gratuitous, that you don't have to give it, which means it's only true on the day of your marriage. That's the day when the gift of self occurs. After that, it's no longer a gift, it's an obligation. And the demons have subtly pushed this idea that, well, since it's a gift, I can just say whenever I want to and when I don't. And it has to be surrounded with all this romance and food and, you know, a nice dinner and all these things, etc. Rather than, look, if the legitimate request is that you have to render it, or she. Because it's, by the way, it's going both ways. As the younger generation comes up, I'm a bit shocked at the fact that the guys are the ones denying the marital debt. It's kind of odd, frankly. In fact, you got to wonder, what kind of man is that? All right. Because most men, it's the opposite, right? The wife has to say, knock it off, right? Okay. After that, so after the marriage, it's no longer gratuitous. It's an obligation. Rather, now it's a matter of justice. So the demons will do several things in relationship to the marital debt. One, they'll get one of the spouses to ask for it too frequently, so that it overburdens and taxes the other spouse, or becomes difficult. Or they'll suggest to you that you don't have to enter the conjugal act unless romance is present, as I mentioned. Or, as St. Augustine says, it was actually a remedy for lust. So that they say, well, you shouldn't do it for that purpose. Part of it has to do with romance. Now, romance, human beings are the only beings that exist that have romance. You don't see rabbits walking up to a woman, you have such beautiful eyes, would you please come up, you know, your fur is so soft, I love your fur. They don't do that. And angels don't have it either because they don't propagate. Human beings are the only ones. But romance, by its nature, is ordered towards conjugal union. It doesn't mean that every time you engage in romance you have to do that. But that's what it's ordered towards, and this is one of the reasons why in the beginning stages of courtship there's certain things about romance that have to be denied the couple, at least initially, until they get closer, until they're married. But the romance is an important thing, but it's secondary. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't have romance in your marriage. You should. In fact, the demons will try and kill it. Why? The first commandment that God gave to Adam and Eve after the fall was, go and be fruitful and multiply. That is the first thing that demons attack, is the fruitfulness within the marriage. This is what's happened. This is one of the reasons why they're working so hard to make sure that people are on contraception before, during, and after marriage. This is also one of the reasons why they're having people use NFP without a sufficient cause. Today we've got this silly thing floating around. People say, because the Vatican, the popes, 3 times have said you have to have a serious cause to use NFP to avoid having children. Serious. So now you've got these people saying, well, serious just means that it's not light, and therefore it's not grave, though. It's not like mortal sin. Yeah, it actually is. In fact, if you look up the word serious in a Latin dictionary, it actually says grave. And that's how the churches always understand it, but now they're trying to shift it because NFP has become the 8th sacrament. But don't get me wrong, I'm not against NFP, especially when people are trying to use it to get, when they're trying to conceive, but when they're trying to avoid it when there's sufficiently grave cause. And the popes have laid out what the grave causes are. Right? So this isn't rocket science, but the demons have been playing with this because why? They're trying to get people to deny the marital debt in relationship to other, even though the people don't know, it still gravely offends God. So, then this means that they have bodily rights over each other. The marital debt, so there's two kinds of bodily rights. They used to call them bed and board. The bed we just got done talking about. Those are rights. You have a right to it. So if you ask your spouse, unless there's a sufficient reason, grave cause, which can be, if the husband says you're standing on a bus and the husband says, let's do it right here, right now. Yeah, sorry. Right. Okay. On the other hand, a headache doesn't suffice. Sorry, I got a headache. Can't do it. Now, it's one thing if it's a migraine and you're incapacitated. It's another thing if you're just using that as an excuse or what have you, or you have it and you're just like, yeah, no, I don't feel like it. Well, that's not the issue. When you got married, you didn't. Your contract didn't say, "I'll render the marital debt when I feel like it." It didn't say that. Okay, but the demons are going to work on that because why? They want to weaponize sex. They want to weaponize it. They want one of the spouses to get to the point where they're using it to control, manipulate, or hurt the other spouse. And they want to do that because, again, why? They want to divide them. The conjugal act is when people are the most vulnerable. Even asking for it puts you in a position of vulnerability, and so they want to make sure that people get hurt in relationship in that area to get it to the point where they're not rendering it at all. So the spouse has rights. People tend to refuse to accept this. People see marriage as license to engage in the conjugal act. They don't see it as the obligation to enter into it when the reasonable request is made. They don't see that side of it. And they don't want to accept it. You say this publicly. I've had people just outright reject it. Demons will cause each other to wound each other and then use the wounds to give excuse not to render the marital debt. That's usually what ends up happening. Or to other things, or to do other things that they're obligated to do. I'm not going to pick up that guy's socks. Who does he think I am? All right. Which, by the way, man, don't leave your socks on the floor. Okay. Demons use anger in order to precipitate our judgment, which we talked about, so that we think something is a matter of justice when it's not. I can't tell you how many times I've listened to spouses talk with each other, and they basically, because their feelings were hurt and they got angry, because St. Thomas says that, as I mentioned, anger makes us go to extremes in our judgment about whether something is right or wrong. And so when we get angry, we think something is actually just. The amount of punishment I'm putting on this person is proportionate, when in point in fact it's disproportionate. And so they'll try and get anger worked into the marriage and relationship to each other. And so what the demons are ultimately trying to do is make sure that the spouses never, ever get into the position of being willing to suffer at the hands of each other. That's what Christ did. Christ suffered for his spouse, us, the church, and he was willing to suffer at our hands for our sake. There has to be, what the demons are trying to do is change your focus from looking at yourself, because this is the things that you see this even with people who are possessed. The first thing the demons are always trying to do is get the person's attention to turn in upon themselves. I can't believe he said that to me. I can't believe he did this, or I can't believe she did that. Right? And so they're trying to get the person to look at their side of the equation. I suffered this. I went through this. I'm not going to do this because you did this to me, rather than being able to let loose of all of that and actually have benignity and benevolence. Benignity is the willingness to do good for people, and benevolence is goodwill. They're trying to chisel away at your goodwill within the confines of the marriage. And so that means that you have to make active choices over and over and over again in the marriage to combat that, which basically means what? You have to make the choices. And by the way, this doesn't apply to marriage. It applies across the board in relationship to relationships in general, or how you live in community life, or what have you. You have to make the choice to be benign and benevolent towards people on a regular basis. You see, your spouse's defect has little to do with your correcting it, except indirectly. In other words, you get these people, and this is another thing that demons drive. Wait till you get married, and then you can just beat her into submission. Or, she will change. Yeah, that's a delusion. People usually get more entrenched in their vices when they get married. So I tell people, look, you got to be able to live with his or her defects before you're even married. You know, you got to know what those are and being able to live with it. If you expect things to change because of the marriage, I'm the bearer of bad news. Sometimes I hate to be, sometimes it doesn't bother me in the slightest. The fact is that it's going to get worse because the demons are going to be under even more attack. Before the marriage, one of the things that they're going to try and do is they're going to try and get the couple to violate, to commit sins against each other so that when they walk into the marriage, those disordered soul ties. What's a soul tie? A soul tie is a connection that we have psychologically, emotionally, or spiritually to somebody as a result of justice or as a result of something we've committed together. What does that mean? When the spouses violate chastity before marriage, the demons are looking for that because that changes the psychological dynamic of the couple walking into the marriage, and then they can use that afterwards to chisel away at it by saying, see, you guys didn't even walk into this marriage right. You never should have gotten married. Now, obviously that's false. You should have gotten married. You shouldn't have done those things beforehand. But we can also, through those acts, end up with attachments. So you'll see couples who end up violating the sixth commandment together have these psychological attachments. God actually designed our brain that way so that when people go through that act, there's an actual physiological mechanism that actually causes a burning of that memory into your imagination very deeply. There's an actual physiological structure to it. And from that, then, even after you leave that and go to someone else, very often the soul ties are this attachment, this memory, these things that you have to these people. And those have to be broken by choice and working against them. But if they're trying to get that before you go into marriage, because they're trying to debilitate the marriage before you even walk down the aisle. So, these bodily rights, they'll use anger. It's one of the things you see in marriage. They're always trying to get the spouses to hurt each other, to say things. So they'll get a spouse who's kind of clueless to say something, and then the other spouse, they'll say, see, look, he doesn't care about you, or she doesn't care about you, and they're constantly doing that. Then, there's the effects of the sins of Adam and Eve. One of the effects was when Eve ate the fruit, the first thing she did afterwards is hand it to Adam, which means what? A, she's taken headship of the family, which we'll talk about in a minute. Second, she's trying to control him, which is why afterwards, at the end, God says to Eve, because you've done this, your desire shall be for your husband. And I've been told that in Hebrew, the desire for in that context means not just that you want to have a stronger inclination to have your husband around and you don't like him going off to work, etc., but it means the desire to control. This is the curse of Eve. It's something that women have to fight. They have to conquer that. And coupled with that is the demons are going to say, your husband is an absolute, colossal, unmitigated, possibly the worst idiot in the history of existence. And anytime he does anything against you, they're just going to reinforce that. See how stupid he is? He's just stupid. Now, he probably is, but that's beside the point. All right. And so they're going to constantly chiseling away at that perspective of how stupid he is, which does what? They're doing that to reinforce, I got to control this guy because he's so stupid. If I don't, he's going to do bad things against me again. Right? Then what does he do to Adam? So Adam does what? Because, it actually says it in Scripture, because you listened to your wife. Which means what? You listen to her, now you're going to listen to her. All right? She's going to try and control you, rant and rave, etc. And so, what is Adam's curse? One of the parts of Adam's curse, because there's several parts to it, same with Eve's, is the more she tries to control him, the less he wants to be around her. So he grows cold. And that basically means what? That the colder he grows, the more she's going to try and control him because she's got this inclination to desire her husband. And so as it goes on, it just gets more and more and more entrenched. And before it's over with, that it's an absolute matriarchy with the guy being effeminate and just trying to hide most of the time going to his man cave. That's usually the structure of marriage if people aren't careful. And the demons will use that curse of Adam and Eve against them to constantly chisel away at them to divide them. And so what you have to do is you have to realize this is the structure of it. This is what we're fighting against. And this is, again, goes back to you have to clear your mind and not, if you know your spouse is of goodwill, then you just have to realize either they don't see what they're doing or they're not perfect. This is one of the things that people think that, they walk into and this is going to be so wonderful. We're going to talk about that later. Marriage is actually a call to sacrifice. And there's actually a structure to that sacrifice. Okay. So the bed and board obligations, because it's a conferral body of right, again, this is not my teaching. This is what the church and the moralists and the saints have taught forever. It's just that it collapsed after Vatican II because people stopped talking about it. According to the moralists, because the wife is a helper, not a slave, but a helper to the husband, it's his obligation and his responsibility to tend or to oversee every single aspect of the household and everything. Now, I'm not suggesting that the husband tells his wife where to put the pots and pans, because if he does, I'm wondering to myself, what kind of guy does that, right? I mean, it just means there's some effeminacy. He's got control issues. But what it means is that what is the husband's job? His job is to raise the children, to work, to provide for that on a material level, and so as a result of that, the wife, so that he can go off and work, has to stay home and take care of the children. There's discovering this even psychologically. There's books coming out right and left. It's hard to keep up with them, in fact. But what they're finding out is that, which the saints have, and the moralists, St. Thomas and Aristotle even talk about this, the first 5 years of a child are absolutely crucial. And the reason they're crucial is why? Because it's during that time that these associations between good behavior and bad behavior arise. So when you punish when you punish bad behavior and you reward good behavior, the child, that foundation of associations in his mind begins to be trained. The child's mind begins to be trained throughout the course of those first 5 years. In fact, the Jesuits used to say, give me your child at the age of 12, because by then there's also been, they've been reinforcing that through virtue, because you can't develop virtue until later. They said, give me a child at the age of 12 and you can have them the rest of your life. This is why Catholics, once they've had a Catholic moral formation, their conscience is always Catholic even when they leave, and their conscience is always bothering them. But what they've discovered is that association of right and wrong has to occur between the ages of, from the time, about 10 months or so until about 5 to 6, depending on when the child comes of reason. They also know that it's the empathy and the emotional empathy of the mother that is the guiding force in that process of directing the good and the bad in the mind of the child. This is why the children, what they've discovered is that children who end up in daycare, they don't get the empathy of the mother. There's not the reinforcement of what's right and wrong. It's a battlefield, because basically they're getting brutalized because there's 30 of them and there's one woman trying to keep them all under control. And so the kid never develops that ability to associate the good and the bad based upon how the mother empathizes or doesn't empathize with the child. So what they're finding out is that this drastic rise in what they call disaffective disorder, which is the inability of people to emotionally connect, is in large part connected to daycare. A psychologist, this is one of the reasons too, the demons know that structure. They've known it forever because they know human nature. And so one of the first things they're always trying to do is get the parents separated, the child separated from the parents, right? This is one of the reasons why communism is so diabolic, because they think it's the state's place to raise their children. Sorry, it's not the state's place. The state only has a right to step in when there's grave violation of the spiritual or physical health of the child. Outside of that, they have no rights whatsoever. But communism thinks that the state has all the rights. Okay. So the other thing is, we just saw yesterday some kid goes in and mows down. I'd be curious to see if the statistic bears out. They know that 80% of these kids are on psychotropic drugs that are mowing everybody down. But the other thing is that a psychologist who's a friend of mine did research. Again, this is not a scientific conclusion, but it is kind of telling. She said she was wondering why these guys are going in and mowing people down in schools, which, by the way, it's usually men rather than girls. I mean, you don't see some girl walking in and mowing people down, and I think there's a reason for that, because I think masculinity is under full-blown attack, and the reason it's under full-blown attack is because the demons absolutely hate the father figure, because they hate God the Father with a complete passion, because he was the one who determined the tasks, and they rejected it, okay? But that all being said, what she discovered is that the only thing these kids ultimately had in common, at least to the sampling that she did, was that they all had been at daycare. So this is one of the things that demons are trying to do, is get them separated. This is why the church has always said that the husband actually has a right to the wife to stay home and take care of the children. The wife has a right to stay home and to be provided for. And this is something, because there's a generation coming up right now, you hear these guys saying this, well, if we can't make the ends meet, you're going to go out and get a job. Excuse me. My father worked 3 jobs so that my mother could stay at home. And if you're going to be a man like him, because I think my father is one of the most masculine men I've met, you're going to have to come up to speed here. Right? And it's just effeminacy, some guy welching on his responsibility. Okay. So he has a right for them to stay home. The children have a right. Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis have all said that the children have a right to be raised by their parents. A right. And it's a grave right because of the fact that it has a grave impact. And so it's important that we recognize this, because why? The demons are going to chisel away at that. They're going to try and get the focus on other things. Usually, they're going to try and get it to the point where they say, you know, really, your child needs a Harvard education, right? No, he doesn't. You have no obligation to get your kid through college. Your obligation is to get them to the age of 18 and at a state in which they have sufficient virtue and sufficient education in order to navigate the world. You're not obligated to send them through college. Is it a good thing to want to send them through college? Yeah, but you cannot commit grave sin by neglecting your children and putting them in daycare in order to do that later. Okay. Another thing that demons will do is try and tempt people to avarice and worldliness to obtain things. You know, the wife should go out home so she can get that extra car. We really want a bigger house. You need to go out and do that. Also, they'll constantly foster this expectation of having a standard of living that is unreasonable. They will incite people to have debt that is, they're not capable of paying it off, right? They're constantly getting people to do this, A, because they want the debt, because the person is not going to fulfill their obligations in justice to the bank or whoever, the credit card company, but they're also trying to do it in order to hold the couple hostage, right, to other people. So if they want a standard of living that's unreasonable. I mean, all of us know that when our parents first got married, they lived in an apartment and they had practically nothing. They were happy to have a couch and a bed. Now, kids get married, they want depending on where you live, a $300,000 to $400,000 house, 2 cars. They want it completely furnished. By the way, they need the boat, of course, and they need to have, ATVs and all this stuff the first year they're married. That is absolutely absurd. The other thing is, too, is it fails to see this. I see this with couples who don't go that route, who don't go the debt route, who just struggle along and they'll have a large family, and so they have to live poorly. There's a certain joy you see in them through the struggle that they're trying to do. They're trying to achieve this by doing it right. There's a certain joy that you see in it. And part of this is because the spouse, again, the demons are trying to tempt the spouses to distract from the children's upbringing in order to bring them something that's not necessary. You don't need that. Demons will guilt parents into thinking that their children do not have a high enough standard of living. Oh, my kids, they deserve better. In fact, what your kid really deserves is for you to help him develop virtue, and if that means he has a lower standard of living, that's a good thing. They did a study. They polled, I think it was like 1,000, maybe a little bit less, but they polled a bunch of billionaires, and they said, what's your biggest concern? Our children have no ambition. Of course they don't. You've constantly given them everything, and this is what demons try and do. They try and use a natural inclination. It's good for parents to want their children to have a good life, but that good life is first of all consummate with virtue and holiness, not with financial assets. But they'll get them focused on that. There's a temptation of a woman to have a career. This all started during World War II. And by the way, the feminist movement, I don't blame the women for that, it's the men. If men were men, when women started piping up and wanting to neglect their household duties, the men would have stood up and said, shut your yap and go home and take care of the children. But instead, what they did is they just let the women have their way. I've actually I did a homily one time where I made the observation that the very structure of the feminist movement today was actually completely outlined by the communists. And if you want to read it, I think it's even online, there's an interview of Vladimir Lenin by Clara Zetkin. And when you read that, it sounds exactly like all the tripe you hear from the feminist movement. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that guys have treated women poorly throughout history. I agree. But the solution isn't for women to go off on their own and to have to have this equality with their husbands. St. Thomas, and this is the thing that demons are always trying to do, is get us distracted with this life. St. Thomas says women are in 3 states. The first state is a state of subordination. So when Eve was created, she was created by the natural law to be under Adam as his helper. But he says the hallmark of that state is that Adam loved her, took care of her, was solicitous of her, etc. Then after the fall, she entered into a state of subjection. And he said the hallmark of that is Adam doesn't take care of her. He's not solicitous of her, etc. But she's still under him because of the natural law. And he says, whereas in heaven, women are neither in a state of subordination or subjection, because some women rule in heaven. Obviously, that's the case. We have Our Lady, right? And a variety of saints. So I tell women, look, in this life, don't try and control your husband. Don't try and be the head of the household. Don't try and wear the pants in the family. Subordinate yourself to your husband in a rightly ordered way according to virtue. And in that process, you'll become holier to him, so then when you're in heaven, you can boss him around for all eternity. Don't go for the short-term payout. All right. But the demons are constantly getting that focused. Look, Adam doesn't like the curse he's under. Eve doesn't like the curse they're under. And so there's that tension of they have to really actively fight that. There's also, during World War II, women actually went to work and they liked the money. They liked the self-sufficiency that it gave them. It's a difficult thing for women to have to ask their husband for money or to be dependent upon him, but that's her state to God. But if the husband is rightly ordered, he will be free with that. Guys will say to me all the time, and this is something that the demons constantly foster, all she does is spend money. Excuse me. What is she supposed to do? Who's buying the groceries? Who's fitting the house? Who's buying the diapers? Excuse me, but that's her job, is to spend the money, but moderately, right? So she has to, guys when they go into a grocery store, or to any other store, unless there's certain kind of stores, like when I go to a used bookstore, I can blow a lot of time there. But usually, guys go into a store, let's get the thing and get out, right? Whereas women they'll pick the product, they'll look at it, they'll put it down, they'll look at the next one, right? And the reason being is because it's right in Genesis. In Genesis, she looked at the fruit and saw that it was pleasing to the sight. She just likes looking at the thing, right? Okay. Now, God gave that to women, though, because why? If you're going to do shopping properly, you got to take the right time. How many times have guys here gone to the store, bought something, and realized later it wasn't even what they were supposed to buy? Right? Okay, guys aren't raising their hand because they're too ashamed to admit it. All right. Reminds me of the joke of Fulton Sheen. I don't know if you've heard this one, but one time when Fulton Sheen was first ordained, the pastor was up there giving the homily about how women are the head of the household. And finally, at a certain point, the pastor says, if there's any man here who can honestly say he's the head of his household, let him stand up. Well, nobody stands up for a little while. Finally, some guy all the way in the back stands up holding his hat. Right? So the pastor says, oh, so you're the head of your household, huh? The guy says, no, my wife told me to stand up. All right. Now, the one thing that women are going to fight, and demons are going to really use that, and this is why what's very sad, the feminist movement is sad. Because women are unhappy. Whenever we give in to the curse, whenever Adam becomes effeminate, or it becomes irresponsible. That is, when a man is not, he's not willing to physically or psychologically or emotionally sacrifice for his wife, and he's not willing to take responsibility, there's a chink in his armor, and he's not satisfied with himself. This is why the millennial men are miserable, because they've been emasculated. But the women, on the other hand, if she tries to control her husband or seeks that self-sufficiently independent, she's miserable. I have never met a woman who works, and this is why demons drive this. They want to make us miserable. I've never met a woman who works full-time when she doesn't need to, who's happy. She might be emotionally satisfied with her career, but she's not at peace, because it's contrary to what God designed her for. So Satan will tempt women towards that self-sufficiency. And that's why, because that's what he did with Eve. It's ambition. He said, you're not going to die. Instead, you're going to be like the gods. He was tempting her to take on and to become self-sufficient herself, independent of Adam. Okay. In Prumer, we read, the wife owes, that's part of the debt, to have attentive, actually the term in Latin is painstaking, care of the education of children. Children have a grave right because it has a grave impact on them. And in domestic matters as her condition demands. The wife sins if she neglects the domestic matters exceedingly, indulging in desires and pleasures. Equally, she sins if she exceedingly indulges in soft living and thus exasperates, actually the Latin term is irritates, her husband. Okay. So what does this mean? If she neglects her duties, she sins. And the degree of the sin is based upon the nature of the neglect. If it's grave neglect, then it's a serious problem. Putting the child in a daycare for 8 hours a day in order to carry on a job which is not absolutely necessary, there's not a grave cause for that. I mean, it's one thing if it's necessary, you're going to lose your house and home, etc. On the other hand, they should not enter into marriage. One of the things I tell people is this. The two of you are working now. After you get married, as long as she can take care of the domestic duties, she can work, providing her husband says okay, and she can work, but once the children come, she's got to stay at home. But in the meantime, once you get married, you stop living off both salaries. You live only on the husband's salary, period. Okay. Because the demons are constantly trying to drive people to set up a situation where they get overextended financially so that both have to work. Marriage is for the sake of children. This means that if one enters marriage without being ready to have children, you see this all the time. Oh, we want to get married, but we're not ready to have children. Well, then you're not ready to get married. The very nature of marriage is ordered towards children. And so this is something which people tend to think that, oh, well, we'll just use NFP for the first couple of years, and then once we kind of get comfortable around each other and we're settled a little bit more, and we get to a certain place financially, we'll have children. Well, then you're not ready to get married at all yet. And part of this is just an immaturity on people's parts. You're just not mature. One time, this one woman, it was kind of funny. She started courting this one guy, and so I started referring, she just liked this guy first. And so I kept referring to him as her boyfriend. She's not my boyfriend yet. Yeah. Then, about 2 months later, they started courting. Oh, how's your fiancé doing? She gets this half smile. He's not my fiancé yet. Yeah. Then once they got engaged, I said, and so her father asked me, well, how did you know this? I said, you could see it. The minute you could see that she saw in this guy something that really drove her emotionally as a woman, and what it was is this was one of the most mature and responsible men I had ever met at the age of 18. Ever. He literally at the age of 19 was ready to start his own business. At 23 he started his own business, and within the first year was already making a profit. At the end, he was, and they wanted to have children immediately, and I'm like, that's the way. This is what it used to be 50, 60 years ago, generally speaking. For the sake of children, one of the things that the demons have done phenomenally well at is convincing people that children are in fact evil and not good. They're not good, right? Why would you get married and have children, right? Or if you have one or two because you kind of want to fulfill that satisfaction, but don't have a lot of them, right? They're not good. This is why we have abortion. The contraception is basically a sign of children aren't good. And so you'll actually see this, which is kind of the height of irony, by the way. And one of the attacks that demons do on people who have a large family is you'll go into the grocery store, for example, because I've heard this example over and over again, and the people will see, how many kids do you have? Oh, we have 7. 7? Can't you control yourself? It's a good thing I'm not standing there. I would just say, are you and your wife on contraception? Yes. Well, you're on contraception, so you don't have to control yourself. That's the whole point, isn't it? It's the inversion, right? Demons constantly invert everything. But the point I'm getting at is that the demons will make children are a burden, a bit of a burden, but there's also a joy that people have in them. And that means that if parents are willing to sacrifice for their children, that's where the whole selfishness thing comes in. The selfishness in relationship to men not willing to deny themselves and be the head of their household, but it's also the selfishness of women in relationship to the curse of Eve and how it's playing itself out in the feminist movement. That selfishness is driving people. The only time they ever have children is when they want the child for themselves, rather than it just being a sacrifice because they want to have a large family. Parents are called to sacrifice for their children and for each other. That means you don't get what you want in marriage. You don't. People have this idea that, I can't wait to get married because it's going to be so lovely living together. Yeah. The fact is, and by the way, marriage is a beautiful institution. It's a magnificent thing when it's lived properly. But a lot of times people don't live it properly. This means that if you enter into marriage without being ready to have children, and you're not willing to sacrifice from day one, then you are not entering into marriage with the right spirit, and the demons are going to use that against your marriage. They're watching you, they're seeing what your motivations are, and they're going to use them against them. This is one of the reasons why there's a certain kind of doctrine called providentialism, which is basically what? Just let God determine when you have children. Most of the time, in fact, in the entire time I've been a priest, 21 years, there's only twice I've told people, you need to go on NFP. One of them was because of the fact that the mother had this grave health condition and they were trying to get it under control. The other one was the woman was literally ready to put in a rubber room. And that's why Pius XI mentions for grave psychological causes they can use NFP. She was literally, they had 6 kids in 6 years and she was like losing her mind. And because she, and basically I just said, look, you're going to have to slow down a little bit until she can kind of get on her feet. Okay. But providentialism is letting God determine it. The demons, because God said, go forth, be fruitful and multiply. Why do the demons attack that? One, because every child is in the image of God, which they hate. Second, every child that's born and is baptized eventually is going to take the place of one of the demons. Because when God created a hierarchy of nature, of angels, and their state of grace was directly proportionate to their nature. And when they fell, they left gaps in that, and so the theological speculation is, that God created man to fill that gap. And so the demons are going to try and make sure every child is killed or never gets baptized in order to make sure that he doesn't get that part that might have been his or what have you. And so this is one of the reasons why demons are constantly attacking the fruitfulness of the marriage. The fruitfulness of the marriage. It's their first attack. And how do they attack the fruitfulness? By dividing the couple psychologically. That's how they end up doing it. You see this all the time, is that people's conjugal life very often takes a beating because psychologically they're completely divided. And that's a very common thing, and the demons have won in a certain sense, because there's not as many children, there's not as much joy in the marriage, etc. Okay. We're going to stop there. In the next conference, we're going to resume how demons attack the notion that marriage is a sacrifice, how they attack that, and what they'll actually do to subvert that. So, if you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et manet semper. Amen.
Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus in
In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, behalf of them through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So, right now, we want to talk a little bit about how demons actually attack another aspect of understanding of marriage, or several actually aspects of marriage. And one of them is the idea that really marriage is a call to sacrifice. If you look in the Old Testament and you look at the spiritual writers, the theologians, they say there's three elements of every sacrifice. The offertory, you have to set the thing aside and offer it to God. Two, you have to slay the victim. So you would offer the sheep. That's what the Jews would do. They'd offer the sheep to God, then they would slay it, and then you would consume the victim so that nothing that was used in the sacrifice would go to profane use. Okay. So those are the three elements: offertory, slaying of the victim, and then the consummation, consuming it. In marriage, it actually meets the structure of a sacrifice. So actually, let's back up. So if you look at Christ, the offertory is done in the Garden of Olives. Not my will, but thine be done. The slaying of the victim, he's actually goes through the passion, and then the consummation is at the end. He's completed everything that's necessary. The soul separates from the body, and it's completed. So the three elements are right there. In marriage, the offertory is the proposal, will you marry me? That's the offertory. And then when the person says yes, that's the offertory back. The demons attack this by not having a proper courtship. This is one of the ways, you've heard me talk a little bit about this before, where they try and set up the relationship before to where people are engaging in things that are inappropriate at certain times in order to affect the relationship going into the marriage. They don't follow the proper rules of courtship, or they have too long of a courtship, or not long enough of a courtship. One time a friend of mine had been dating a girl for 6 years. I said, this is unjust. You either marry her or tell her to go away. One of the two. They ended up marrying her. She's a great gal and they have a good marriage. But it's like, it's time to get moving here. The offertory, can you hear me now? The offertory, thank you, Father. The offertory is the proposal. There's an offering. Are you willing to do this? And the offering is, I'm offering you bodily rights in relationship to me. That's the offertory. And so this is important because parents have to watch over that beginning process to make sure that before the offertory is ever done, before there's any offering or proposal, that things are actually in place. One of the common things that I probably get it about once or twice a month. A married couple will approach me and say, my daughter, or son for that matter, is dating somebody who's bad for them. So I tell them, well, there's a very simple solution. You basically just say a binding prayers against any demons, or prayers against any demons that are keeping them together. Because demons can drive those amorous feelings, as I mentioned. And so it's like clockwork. It's literally like clockwork. There's only one case where the woman had to do the mother had to do the binding prayers for about 2 months. It's always within 3 to 4 weeks, that the bad person in the relationship will leave. It's pretty common. So the offertory, and so the demons are actually trying to affect that process by which the offertory is made, or the proposal is made, and all the precursors that go up to the marriage, because they're trying to jade the relationship before the marriage. Next is the slaying of the victim. This is when the person, this is the actual, when the people actually exchange vows. That's when you're dying to yourself in marriage. By saying, do you take him to be your husband? Yes, then you're giving bodily rights to him. That means you've died to your sole control over your body, and now he has a certain amount of rights in relationship to that, and vice versa, that she has rights in relationship to him. That's the slaying of the victim. That's when you have to die to yourself by virtue of the fact that you're making a promise before God to do certain things that are now outside your control. And that's not always going to be in accord with your will. It's part of the dying. Once people are married, they expect things from their spouse rather than seeing it as a form of serving each other. This is a problem. That is, people don't see marriage as an opportunity to serve each other. They're just thinking about, what am I getting out of this? St. Joseph was there to serve God by taking care of Mary and Jesus. Our Lady called herself the handmaid. Handmaid means servant, literally. Do it to me according to thy word, not mine. But she said she wanted God's word to be done. So how she served was not her determination. How we serve in marriage is not a determination. It's determined by the church and the circumstances that God determines in your lives, the children he sends to you, etc. And yet Our Lady perfectly accepted whatever God wanted in relationship to that. So there has to be that willingness to die to yourself to serve the other individual. This death, this dying to yourself, is a lifelong process. It's not just at the day of your marriage. It's just not throughout the beginning process. It's ultimately, this dying is that God is calling you to that. It's an ongoing sacrifice for the totality of the duration of your marriage, because you've entered into a contract which you don't have your rights. You don't get them back until the other spouse dies, basically. The demons are going to try and jade that by doing what? Driving people to be selfish. Now, this is just part of original and actual sin, but the principal thing that they're going to try and do is drive them expecting, the spouses will be expecting certain things from the other spouse all the time. And you even kind of see this. One of the sins against marriage, against spouses, is called ill use. This is the guy who does throw his socks onto the floor, right? Or the wife who just, doesn't, or spends an extraordinary amount of money on stuff that's not necessary, and as a result the husband has to work more in order to cover what's being spent. But there's different ways in which this is done, but the demons will actually drive people to become very selfish and expect the other person to render to them what they want. Now, obviously, if it's the marital debt, there's a certain legitimacy in that because they have a right to it. On the other hand, there's certain things that the person shouldn't expect. That is, there should be a kind of selfish. It shouldn't be what you're going to get from your spouse. It's what you're going to give to them. It should be really the mindset. But the demons are do what? The first thing the demon did when he sinned is choose himself and what he wanted over the will of God. That's what he did. His very act was by nature selfish. Well, they replicate hell in our lives. So that means that in marriage, they're constantly trying to make the spouses selfish in relationship to a discussion or in relationship to an expectation, or thinking that they owe this to me or what have you, rather than how am I going to serve my spouse the best. The next is the consuming of the victim. This means it has to be total and complete. The consummation of marriage, there's two ways that this is done. The consummation of marriage after they're married, right? They engage in the conjugal act, and from that point on, boom, nobody can divide it, not even the Pope. Okay. So this means that part of that is the consuming of the victim means it has to be total, which means that any time the reasonable request is made, you have to render it. But the second one is that they have to serve each other selflessly. You should not be going into marriage thinking about what you're getting out of it. You should actually be going into marriage thinking about how am I serving God and how am I going to be doing good for my spouse and my children. That should be ultimately what you should be doing, because you have to die to yourself completely, and it's through your spouse or through your marriage that that's done. Most spouses have the same attitude that a nun did when she wrote Spiritual Daughter. I think it was a Padre Pio, but don't quote me. It might have been John of the Cross. But she wrote to him and said, I would be a much holier nun if it wasn't for all these other nuns in the convent. I can't tell you how many times I hear spouses say, I'd be a lot holier if my husband would just get his act together. Or I would be a lot holier if I just didn't have to deal with my wife's nagging, or whatever the case is. right? And I'm like, oh no. I have the same response that John of the Cross had, or Padre Pio, which is, oh no, it's that person's imperfections that are precisely the means of your sanctification. It's precisely because your husband is a slob and lazy is how you are going to master charity. And it's precisely in her nagging that you're going to master that love of somebody and doing good for them despite how they feel. Because quite frankly, that's exactly what God did. If you look at the cross is the absolute inversion of everything that is diabolic. The cross is the manifestation of returning what Christ said, returning good for evil. We committed sin. In return, he offered his life to us for our salvation. The demons are the opposite. God was so good to them in what he initially gave to them, and they turned around, and instead of rendering good for good, they rendered evil for good. In marriage, you have a choice. You are either going to end up following the path of the demons, or you're going to follow the path of God. You're either going to render good for evil to your spouse, or you're going to end up rendering evil for good. One or the other. There's no way around it. And so the point is that you have to look at your marriage and say, is my real intention in relationship to my spouse to be good to them? You can say, do you love your wife? Yeah, I love my wife. Well, why are you doing this to her then? Because she annoys me. What does her annoyance have to do with the price of tea in China as far as you're rendering her good? There's this attitude that, I will render the person good as long as they're being good to me. Well, if that's the case, you might as well just pack your bags and move to another location, because that's just not going to happen in marriage all the time. Hopefully it happens most of the time, but you just have to realize that even when people want to do the good, they're just going to cause harm to each other. It's just the nature of original and actual sin. But it's precisely through those things that people can grow holy. When your spouse does something against you, there's two things that the demons are going to say, see, you've got to cut him off, you've got to do this, or see, she's doing this to you, and so just go out to your man cave and ignore her for the next 3 days. Right? So this is the temptation that the demons are going to put, because they're constantly trying to divide, because it's through division that they can conquer. Rather than what? St. Thomas says that the principal effect of love is union. When you love something, you want to be one with it. That's just the nature of it. Okay, so if you really love your spouse, you're going to want to be one with them, but that means you're going to have to remove the obstacles, and those obstacles are primarily your own interior emotional disorders in relationship to them. People say, well, how do I know what my vice is? Well, do you have anger? Yeah, well, there you go. All you have to do is watch your emotional reactions in relationship to your spouse, and that will tell you. I think having spouses together, putting them together, is a fantastic thing, because you can find out an enormous amount of people's interior lives and how virtuous they are by how they treat each other. If they're constantly beating each other up, you're just like, boy, you haven't mastered, and you can just go down the litany, right? And so sometimes people come to me and they say, how do you master these, what St. Thomas calls antecedent appetites? See, our emotions either follow reason, or they occur before and contrary to reason. Well, if they occur before and contrary to reason, that means you don't have virtue. Because if they're virtuous, virtue is literally the life of reason and so as you start to gain virtue in a particular area, when you gain the virtue of meekness, your spouse will do something, and there will be absolutely no reaction on your part in relationship to this whatsoever. What reminds me of that commercial, I don't know if you saw it, it was a football commercial where there's this referee, he's standing there, and the two coaches are screaming in this guy's ear, and he's just standing there like this, like nothing's happening. And the announcers are like, look at him, he's a rock. Nobody is getting to him. He's not even listening to anything they're saying. Look at him, nothing's getting to him. And then they pan into his face, and they pan out, and his wife is in his ear. Okay. What does this mean? It means he's tuned her out, and in the meantime, what did that do? It made his wife even worse, because now she's trying to control him anymore because he won't do what she wants. I tell women, look, this is exactly the dynamic that demons are trying to do, but this tells you that you should really be rendering good for evil in marriage. If you do that consistently, When we do something bad, but somebody does good back to us, it causes a natural softness in our hearts in relationship to them. We feel bad and we want to do right by them. This is exactly what you need in marriage. Whereas the demons are going to do the opposite. They're going to get you to do bad for bad, rather than good for good, good for evil. The demons then also attack the goods of marriage, and there's different kinds of goods of marriage. There's a few of them. The primary purpose of marriage, of course, is children, which we've talked about. Now, this is attacked, as I mentioned, by not getting people to have children or be generous with God in relationship to just allow Him to determine the number of children that they have. But it also the attack in recent years is trying to get people to believe that there's not a primary end of marriage. What most people don't understand is that there's actually a difference between the primary end of the natural law institution of marriage and the sacrament of marriage. The primary end of the natural institution of marriage is children, and then all those other things are secondary in relationship to that. In fact, the reason the guy works is to provide for the children, provide for his wife so she can take care of the children. And as I mentioned, even romance is ultimately ordered towards having children. But the fact that we've completely divorced those two is it's a sign of our culture, is, as I mentioned before, slowly slipping into insanity. But the finality, the primary end of the sacrament of matrimony is the mutual salvation of the spouses. This is why the church, those two things, that is, for the sake of having children, etc., this is why one of the things that the demons will very often do is attack the matrimony by doing two specific things. One is chiseling away at the spouses so that they're not really helping each other save each other's souls. That's your primary job, is to get your spouse into heaven. The second thing is in relationship to children, not just blocking them from actually having children, but setting up a situation where the children take precedence over the spouses. The fact of the matter is that the primary obligation that a woman has is not to her children. Her primary obligation is to her husband. The primary obligation that the husband has is to his wife, not to the children. It's why? Is because actually because of the contractual obligation. Eventually the children are going to be gone. Now that doesn't mean that the spouses don't sacrifice, etc. But how would we know this? Well, it's pretty easy. You know, if some guy walks in here and he starts shooting people, you know, you're not going to take your wife and put them in front of the kids, right, to shield them. You're going to put yourself there ultimately. But which is actually, this is one of the things I've always wondered, by the way. One of the signs that masculinity has completely collapsed. When I grew up, if some guy would have walked into a classroom with a gun, he might have got a few shots off, but the entire class of men would have completely bombarded. They would have completely taken that guy out. They wouldn't have cared how many guys died. They're going to take that guy out. Now they're all cowering off in the corner. I'm like, what? Literally, okay, so 2 or 3 guys would have died, but they would have saved 20 or 30 kids, but instead, that's not happening. Okay, that all being said, I don't want to get into a rant. But the point is well, maybe I do, but I have to control that. But the point is that what happens is that very often there's a triangulation that starts to happen within marriage when kids come around, where the parents will start favoring the children over the spouse, or they'll actually allow the children to create this triangulation, which demons are constantly trying to undermine authority. So what they'll do is they'll go to dad and say, "Hey, Dad, can we go to the park?" And the dad says, "No, because you've got to go out and do this thing." Okay. So then they run over to mom. "Mom, can we go to the park?" "Yeah, that's fine. Go over there. Go over. You can go to the park." And so there's this they're constantly trying to set up this contravening of the authorities within the family, so that they don't follow proper authority structure. That's the one thing that demons follow. Once you've lost grace, and once you've lost love and the ability to love, and once you've lost all the goodness and everything else, there's only one thing left: power. That's it. In hell, there's only one thing left, is power. And they have a very strict pecking order in hell. So but what's ironic is that when the demons get involved in everything else, they're constantly chiseling away at that authority structure. Constantly. So they're constantly chiseling away in the mind of the wife about her husband's headship. The husband, this is something that you're seeing rather commonly, will very often disrespect the legitimate authority the wife has over the children as their mother. And so even though he has the final say, nevertheless, if a child won't do what the mother legitimately has told the child, it's the father's place to step in and tell him, no, you're going to do it. And if you don't do it, step outside and we'll put an end to this. The point being is that there has to be that maintaining of the authority structure, because the demons are going to be constantly chiseling away at that. And that means the second thing is that marriage is so to save your souls, but then also for the sake of the children. So that's what it's ordered towards. But the spouse's ordering is to the children through the other spouse, ultimately. The second purpose is mutual help and moral regulation of the satisfaction of the sexual urge, according to the moralists. Mutual help, what does this mean? This is where the board comes in. They have to help each other. By the way, I've mentioned this before, the primary obligation for every single thing in the house, the primary obligation to make sure that it's all taken care of, resides with the husband. The wife is just simply there to help him do his job. That's her function. So when I hear guys say, "Oh, I never change diapers, that's a woman's job." Oh, really? Technically, it's your job as the father. Your wife just happens to be here because God put her here to help you out with it. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that women and men have a distinction of roles based upon dispositions and what we call natural delegation. But there's certain dispositions. I mean, obviously, women are just a lot better taking care of kids, a large number of kids. And how do we know this? And this is one of the things, like, you see this with men. You get 6 kids with a guy, especially when they're young, and after about three hours, it's time for him to go to the rubber room. Whereas the wife can kind of keep track of it, and it doesn't bother us. It's kind of hard for her at times, it's true, but she can kind of deal with it a little bit better because she's got the dispositions. The other thing is, too, is that men and women are different in the sense that they multitask differently. Men actually there's a technical term for it, it's called inattentional blindness. It's the ability to focus on one thing and tune everything else out. That's why he's flipping through the channels, the wife's talking to him, and he doesn't hear a thing she says. Why is that important? Because you have to be able to focus on your job, and when you go to war to fight the battle, you have to be able to tune everything out. That's actually why they removed women from the front lines during the first Gulf War, because they found out even with training, when the bullets started to fly, they couldn't tune it out because they're not structured in their brain to do that. Rather, they're intended to do what? To keep track of a number of different things superficially. Why? For the sake of children. This is why women can be changing the diapers, and the kids are upstairs trying to burn the house down, and she just all of a sudden, "What are you guys doing up there?" The kid's like, "I know she has eyes in the back of her head. She has to. There's no way she could know this," right? Women are structured that way. It's a perfection. It's a good thing for the sake of having children, right? Whereas a guy, he just changes the diaper, and in the meantime, the house is already half burnt down before he even realizes there's smoke in the room. All right. So, but they both have their specific places. But the point is that the demons have been, and you see this in our culture, they have systematically destroyed the value of the different roles of men and women. The value of them. When they did brain studies on women, they found out that a woman, the speech center in her brain is 3 times the size of a man's, and she gets 10 times the amount of pleasure out of talking that a man does. It's a perfection when it's moderated. Why is it? They found out that if you don't talk regularly with and at children from the age of 10 months to 5 years,
it will literally cause brain damage. And that's why God gave that perfection to women, because it's easier for them to talk to the children, and it gets them, and it's also necessary to help the children learn to have proper relationships and emotionally bond, etc. But that's why it's there. These are perfections. But this tells you that there's a role for women. Because it's a perfection that men don't have. So guys are designed more to be quiet and to focus on other things, etc. But there's different perfections in men and women, and as a result of that, the fact that they're destroying these things is sad. In fact, if you look at it and you listen to the feminist movement, you look at what's going on in a culture, it's sad at the fact that all these perfections that women have been denigrated, ignored, lessened, and treated like there's something wrong with them. Right? Like the fact that a woman has a strong natural inclination to want to be with her children. No, you should go out and get a job. Right? The fact that they have these different roles based on their perfections, the demons have been chiseling away with that. Why? Because they're trying to get to the children. They know if they mess up the relationship with the parents, they can get to the children. And that's their goal, to mess the children up. Their goal is to wound us. Why? Because when you're wounded, you're weak. Now, this is an important point, because one of the most damaging things that demons drive in relationships of marriage is getting the spouses to argue in front of the children. Why does that cause damage? Children have a natural inclination to respect and love the authority of their parents. And so when they are hurting each other in front of them, they're literally stuck in this situation where there is emotional damage because they actually have to choose between one or the other when they don't want to. This is why I tell people, look, unless your wife or your husband is strangling the children, and I literally mean that they're strangling them or drowning them or beating them to the point where the kid's going to end up in the hospital, you don't say anything in front of the children when it comes to harsh words or anything like that, period. So all the minor stuff, you just, and I tell this with wives, don't say anything. Don't countermand his authority. You're just going to end up with this problem of it affecting the children. I tell women, and this is what the demons are after. The demons are after this. I'm going to incite the wife to find what the husband's doing annoying and to get her to correct him. Why? Because then the children learn that instead of being subordinate to right order authority, you can countermand them. Then the wife wonders, why are my kids disobedient? They learned it from you. That's where it came from, and that's what the demons are actually after. Then, of course, what are the demons trying to do? The demons are trying to get the husband to not treat the wife with any kind of respect, because why? They want to do two things. Children learn the relationship that they're supposed to have with the opposite sex from their parents. So what happens? Psychologically, they just learn this implicitly. They make these associations. They see this going on. When the husband is treating the wife terribly, when the men go out there, they'll start treating the wives terribly, and they're not even, or their girlfriends terribly, and they don't even know why. It's because they've already got this association. It's the way to cause damage. And when the wife doesn't submit, the girls will learn that, and so this is what they end up learning in relationship to taking that on. They're trying to get to the children. So I tell people, look, instead of arguing in front of the children, never argue in front of the children, unless, again, he's literally murdering them. Then you step in. Otherwise, even if it's a minor defect or something, you leave it alone. And then what you do is you talk about it behind the scenes, quietly and respectfully. But this also means two things. It means, one, is you don't argue because you're trying to maintain the fact that if the children know that if I ask mom and she says no, there's no point in going to dad because he's going to say, what did your mother say? Whereas if they can get that contravening thing, it's just a way to manipulate them and get what they want, as I mentioned, triangulation. But the other side of it is as I mentioned again, because you want to make sure that they understand that how that actual authority structure works in relationship to children. But the part of it is that when they learn that the husband was always respectful of his wife, they never argued, and the wife was respectful of the authority of the husband. That's the type of father or husband that the father, because women marry their fathers very often, that's the type of husband they're going to start looking for. And the children know that. The definition of peace is the tranquility of order. When the spouses are arguing, there's not order and there will not be peace in the family. And that's exactly the attack the demons are trying to do. They're trying to upset things because why? They're trying to upset the peace that children need in order to develop virtue. When kids, because why? Again, remember when I said that if you have an antecedent emotion, that's a sign you don't have any virtue? Well, if your parents are arguing all the time, there's this upsettingness, and so you're literally trying to grow in virtue in an environment that is just causing all these antecedent appetites, so it becomes more difficult. The demons are extraordinarily smart. They understand exactly how this stuff works. The other good of marriage is they say that St. Augustine says this is a remedy for concupiscence. This is how to keep people chaste within the confines of marriage. Okay. Attacks on the properties of marriage. First property is unity, monogamy. And there's different kinds of unity. There's intellectual emotional union. And remember, I mentioned that the diabolic attack is first to attack the perceptions, because they have to drive that destruction of the intellectual unity that the spouses have. This is also one of the reasons why it's so dangerous to get married in a mixed marriage, because you're starting out your marriage without intellectual unity off the bat about some of the most essential things that govern marriage and raising of children, which is the moral life. And there also is this emotional unity. This is also why you can't follow your emotions in marriage, because the demons have that influence, and in order to have emotional unity, you have to develop virtue. In the end, you'll see this. In the spouses that are trying to grow holy together and work on their virtues, and they go to their own corners and work on their own defects, this is one of the things. Don't go into marriage again expecting your spouse to change. Don't expect your spouse to change. You have to change in relationship to your spouse. One of the things I'll often tell guys that are in religious communities when they're getting angry with how the superiors are dealing with things like, okay, the superior is probably doing something bad. That's probably true. It's irrelevant as to what your response needs to be. Your response needs to be virtue, not anger. Then there's physical unity. And physical unity, God made us as human beings that we actually develop a bond for people by being tactile, showing proper affection in a rightly ordered way. And this lack of affection or lack of rendering the conjugal act can detract, that lack of physical unity can detract from it. You'll see this from time to time when guys get married after about 2 or 3 years. Showing a certain amount of affection for your wife requires a certain amount of energy. And so eventually they're just like, it's not worth it, right? When they're first dating, they want to show it to him because they're hoping to get something. But until then, after they're married, after a little while, they're like, there's no point in it. But that affection, that physical affection that's rightly ordered according to modesty and according to their state in life, is something that the demons can't stand. They cannot stand rightly ordered affections. Why? Because they hate everybody and hate everything, and they don't want anyone else enjoying those affections for each other. Spiritual unity. Again, I mentioned the dangers of mixed marriage. Sometimes they turn out okay, sometimes they don't. But without unity and belief, there will always be a lack of intellectual unity among the partners, and the demons will chisel away at this. The other side of it is again, the demon's goal is the children. According to the fathers, one of the sins that Eve committed was usurpation. She usurped the authority that Adam had in determining the code, that is, the moral behavior of the members of the family. It's his obligation to determine the code and the cult, they said. That is, the worship and the moral life that plugs into that worship and is the antecedent and leads to that worship. It's the husband's place to oversee that and to make sure that it's actually done and kept in place. The primary obligation to make sure that the spiritual lives of the children and the wife are advancing is the husband's, not the other way around. If a husband doesn't do that, and demons constantly chisel at this, they will constantly get the husband to be a spiritual slacker and just leave it to his wife. It's effeminate, quite frankly. Because to be disciplined spiritually is hard, it's difficult, and that's what men are supposed to do. They're supposed to deal with hard and difficult things. But they will work at that. But the problem with mixed marriages is if the husband isn't Catholic, the fathers say the husband's place is to confirm the code and the cult. So when the wife teaches it, it's his place to confirm, yes, this is how you worship God. This is how you pray. This is how you are to behave. But if he's not that way, the wife can train the kids till the cows come home, and almost inevitably, not always, but a large portion of the children coming out of that are spiritually tepid at best, because there hasn't been that confirmation psychologically. If the wife isn't Catholic and the husband is, you might have the confirmation, but the wife's not going to teach the cult and the code, and so the children never get a thorough, deep grasp of the spiritual life. This is one of the reasons why I tell people, just don't get involved with mixed marriages. Then, of course, they work against the sacramental unity. Once the people are married, that's it. It's indivisible. You can't divide it. And demons are constantly trying to drive divorce. Constantly. You know, it gets me. People will say things like, oh, well, you know, at a certain point I fell out of love with her. So what? What's that got to do with relationship to your obligations and rights to her as your wife? All that means is what? You have an obligation, as St. Paul says, husband, love your wife. You got to work at this. Marriage is work. And the demons are always trying to get it to, you shouldn't have to work at this. Your spouse should just be doing these things for you. And so the attitude of that somehow or another that you should just divorce, you should fall in love with her, or, oh, it just didn't work out. What do you mean it didn't work out? One of my favorite lines from movies is the one from Addams Family, Values. There's a certain point in which Morticia says to Gomez, she says, speaking about Fester and the woman, I can't remember what her name was, says, don't they make a lovely couple? And he says, he's a man, she's a woman. Perfect match. All right. In other words, the church has never said that the marriage had to be this hunky-dory, wonderful thing in order for people to have a good and holy marriage. Those are just things that help that. But the demons are constantly trying to chisel away at the sacramental unity. And today, of course, we have the problem of polygamy. It's called divorce and remarriage. Divorce and remarriage. Divorce. That's just serial polygamy. And it's kind of interesting because one of the when the divorce and remarriage question started coming up among the cardinals, it was the Africans of all people, the African cardinals, who were saying, well, that's just serial polygamy, what you guys are saying. Of course, the German bishops got all worked up about it. And then there's the problem of annulments. Now, most annulments, you know, annulments is it's a bit of a problem. What I discovered in the annulments is the scandal isn't so much in the number of the annulments, although it is kind of scandal. The scandal is in how colossally stupid people are in getting married. That's where the scandal is. People today, and you see this among the youth, the young people today do not understand the essence or the fundamentals of marriage at all because of the lack of catechesis. And of course our culture is completely, what is, I mean, you want to ask people, well, what is marriage? What is it? I mean, I don't even think people could even give you a definition of it. Then there's the propagation of the idea, as I mentioned, if it doesn't work, you just get a divorce. The unity has to also be in how you raise your children. This is stuff that you have to work out beforehand. The husband has an obligation to take counsel with his wife in relationship to the children. It's an obligation. The obligation is not a matter of justice, by the way. It's not a matter of justice to the wife that he has to listen to her about the children. The reason he has to listen to her about the children is because she's working with them day in and day out, and she understands them and can give him a viewpoint to where he understands the circumstances properly, and as a result of that, he can actually be prudent. His obligation, if he doesn't listen to his wife about the dispositions of the children and their behavior, he is violating the virtue of prudence. It's sinful. In fact, it's against the fourth commandment. And so he has to take custody. On the other hand, the wife has to get into the disposition of, I'll say my piece, and I'm shutting up, and it's your responsibility. It's your monkey, not mine. And he, by the way, your son does look like a monkey, but that's beside the point. Okay. But there has to be that unity, not allowing the triangulation, being that consistently that unity. Then there's, of course, fidelity. The demons will attack fidelity. Now, fidelity is the exclusivity in which you're faithful to one individual, and that fidelity is not just in relationship to the conjugal act, it's in relationship to all aspects, intellectually, emotionally, and affections, in all aspects that revolve around the ordering towards marriage or the conjugal act. What does that mean concretely? It means that, you hear people say, well, I can look, but I can't touch. No, you can't even look. You have to practice custody of your eyes. In relationship to affections, in relationship to the conjugal act, or in relationship to the affections, or relationship to romantic, that your wife has an exclusive right to those. Exclusive. Every time a guy does that, contrary to rights, where he's looking at pornography, which is a complete violation of fidelity, then basically what he is doing is he's violating her rights to exclusivity, and vice versa with women. This is why, if a woman notices that that the person they are dating is looking at other, if she's dating some guy and he's constantly looking at other women, don't expect emotional fidelity after marriage. Don't expect it. If the guy, in fact, this is what's so ironic. One of the ways that demons attack fidelity in marriage is through immodesty in women before marriage. What does that mean concretely? They're constantly, because guys are more visual than women. And so what the demons are trying to do is drive the immodesty so that the guy has to keep his custody of the mind, or custody of the eyes. And so what the demons will do is you'll even see this. Women say, I can't seem to find a decent man. Well, maybe if you covered 3/4 of your skin that isn't covered right now, you might have a better luck at it. And they'll look at you like, first of all, women get very angry when you talk about anything that has to do with modesty, or what they're wearing, because it hits home to them. Because women were given a natural inclination to have a proper appearance, to be judged properly by Adam. That's where that came from. But what they do is they'll dress immodestly, and they'll say, well, I don't want him thinking those bad thoughts, but I want him to find me attractive. So you don't want him thinking those bad thoughts, but you want him to have thoughts that are bad in order to attract you. The point being is this: the virtuous man will turn away from what's immodest. If a woman's immodest, a good man is going to ignore her and turn away from her. It doesn't matter how good looking she is. It doesn't matter about her other virtues. If she's not modest, he's not going to pay attention to it. But what happens is that men themselves don't practice custody of the eyes, which is part of modesty. And the demons drive that. They drive the immodesty because they're trying to chisel away at the men's emotional fidelity to their wives or to their girlfriends. Before marriage, it's only once it's clear that the person has sufficient virtue and is willing to enter and can manifest that they can be exclusive in their affections to the individual that you can actually enter into the espouse, that you actually espouse. That is, you're actually engaged. But what's happening is with all this immodesty, guys don't have this custody of the mind, and so they don't have this emotional fidelity, which then affects the marriage. They attack it by adultery. They attack it when one spouse leaves their former family. This is another way that they chisel away at the fidelity. You see this among men today. I'm like, what is wrong with these guys today? Makes me want to break out some kind of a stick where you beat them. But the point is that these guys, they have a really strong relationship with their brother, their sisters, or their mother, or their father, or what have you. And then when they get married, their emotional affiliation or fidelity is really to their family and not to their wives. And so they won't defend the wife, they won't protect the wife from the bad things that the family does against her, etc. And they always use, well, they're my family. Not anymore. I mean, they are in one sense, but your primary obligation is to your wife. And so you see that lack of fidelity by not even separating from their family. You see this all the time happening among the millennials, unfortunately. The other one is indissolubility. This is the tax on the permanency of marriage. From time to time, I'll get an email from a priest, and they'll ask the question, does a prenuptial agreement invalidate the marriage? It does, if in the prenuptial agreement it's understood that the marriage isn't permanent. There are some prenuptial agreements that actually don't violate it. So like, for example, a couple may come together whose both spouses have died. They decide to get married, they're both 65, but they want their respective properties to go to their respective children. They can enter into a prenuptial agreement so that that happens. But ultimately, and this is something that's important, what most people don't realize is, in the end, everything that is owned in the marriage is owned by the husband. Everything in the marriage, all the money of the children under the age of 18, all the money of the wife is, technically speaking, according to the natural law and the entire tradition of the church, the property of the husband. Now, their church is also very clear that they make it that the husband has an obligation to administer that in fairness, in justice, for the sake of his wife. It's not there to hoard stuff. I mean, when you hear about husbands who make their wives go out and work, and then they don't reveal to the wife they're millionaires, which, by the way, I've seen that happen twice. The husband was literally a millionaire and made the wife go out and work to buy food. Okay. The point being is that the prenuptial agreements can actually involve that, but the point is the demons are attacking the indissolubility of marriage. That marriage isn't permanent. Oh, if this doesn't work out, I'll just get a divorce. They think that marriage is a human institution. It's just a human contract. No, it's a natural law institution. It's a natural law contract. It's the one that God structured and designed, and so it's Him that you're making these vows before of. Even when you go to a justice of the peace, St. Thomas says, even if you're not standing before a minister of God, if it's a vow or a promise, you're literally swearing before God you're going to fulfill these things, because why? Otherwise, it's not a promise or a vow in the proper sense. So people just go to the justice of the peace, but they don't think that they're swearing before God. Then it's, technically speaking, not marriage. Okay. But the demons are attacking that indissolubility. Why? To get to the children. They want to cause trauma to the various spouses and cause damage to them so that it's hard for them to, they want them to be wounded in the process of divorcing and all that and splitting up, because then it becomes more difficult, because nobody in heaven is wounded. No one. Everybody in heaven has to be healed, because when we're wounded, we put up blockages. And this is true even in relationship to God. You have to be healed in order so that you remove that blockage from God. So everybody in purgatory is healed before they get to heaven. Everybody in hell is completely wounded. And so the demons are trying to replicate that, but the reason they're trying to wound the spouses is so they can create this blockage, this wall between them and God. But it's also to get to the children, because children, again, have a natural law inclination to have love, respect for both parents. And so when they split, the children end up suffering in that process. They attack the sacrament. They attack the sacrament and the sacramental graces. They attack the sacramental validity of these marriages all the time. People are absolutely clueless getting married. When I was a deacon, I decided, I want to work on a tribunal to see how this stuff works, right? So they had me review 13 cases, and some of these cases, the level of ignorance and stupidity was so profound that when you looked at it, you're like, these people never should have gotten a permit to even date, right? I mean, they're just that clueless. And why are they clueless? Because the churches, the demons have done a good job in making sure that the priests don't preach. The catechesis isn't being done about the nature and structure of marriage. What's necessary to have a valid marriage. Most people don't even know that. In fact, when you're preparing people for marriage, it's a quasi-nightmare as a priest. Because literally you have to have this whole list of stuff, and you're like, okay, have you had a prior bond? No. Okay, have you had that? And you have to go through all these things because there's all these different things that can invalidate the marriage. And the number of people that haven't been married before and are getting married for the first time, who aren't shacking up or having sex, who are actually both Catholic and are actually leading their Catholic lives, even in a traditional parish, is maybe 1 in 10. You're like, in fact, as one priest said, I would rather bury my father 5 days after he buried his father than perform a marriage. It's that bad sometimes, because of the fact that you're constantly dealing with people's emotions, etc. And as a priest, when you realize that people have issues, you have to slow it down, and then they're chaffing at the priest about it, and then they want to set the date before they're really even prepared, and it's just a nightmare. But the point is that this is how the demons use, these are the things the demons use to attack the validity, to get people to enter into marriage in an invalid way. This is also how they got modernists to hijack the diocesan programs in relationship to marriage prep. I mean, some of these things, you go to these marriage preps. I actually wrote an article once. I wanted to do it under a pseudonym, but the editor said, oh, no, you don't. This has to be put out in your own name. And basically in there I talk about the fact that to go into a group of couples who are mixed, they're not married yet, they're already struggling with chastity, and then you're going to talk about anatomical details of NFP in mixed company, and you really think that's a mature approach? You're just going to end up with a bunch of people having to go to confession before this is all over with. There's attacks to block various ways of graces given to marriage. Demons can cause people to forget that the sacramental graces of marriage are not just on the day of your marriage, but every single day. You can actually draw on the sacrament every single day. The graces, and this is how you combat it, depending on it. The graces are for the spouses to have fidelity and dissolvability in their relationship. It's actually, the graces are there to help them to deal with each other's imperfections and to help to raise children. That's what the graces are structured for. And so a lot of times people don't work at drawing on the sacramental graces, and they keep demons from actually looking at that. The demons keep the people from looking at the necessity of drawing upon the graces of the sacrament on a regular basis. Demons seem to block actual graces to help spouses to live together who suffer from defects of original and actual sin. They'll constantly, the one spouse will pray and pray and pray and pray and pray for the other spouse. And what do the demons do? They just step in and just pick at the guy's emotions or pick at the woman's emotions to keep them from responding to the graces. They drive the vices in one spouse to drag the other one down spiritually. And this is part of it. A lot of times people will come to me, and it's both men and women, where the wife is a complete mess or the husband's a complete mess, and they're struggling with this, and they fail to realize that it's precisely through their spouse that they're going to grow holy, as I mentioned before. You have to see marriage as an opportunity of grace. Demons have blocked that from people's minds. Then, of course, the demons are working on attacking marriage by the state. This is appalling. The state has gained way too much ascendancy. These people have gotten way too big for their britches. The fact that they think that they can step in and make determinations, regarding the structure and nature of marriage. The fact that they can actually determine the definition of marriage. If you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et manet semper. Amen.
Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspiration, carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be happy in and through Christ our Lord. Virgin most prudent, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. I want to just kind of wrap up a few things that sometimes they call these the sins against marriage. And these are the things that demons will actually drive in order to cause difficulties within the family. We've talked a little bit about things like ill usage and denying the marital debt and things of that sort, but there's a few other ones. One of the things that will very often happen is that they will drive kind of a want or a lack of gentleness and consideration in regard to each other's faults. What the demons will do, as I mentioned, they affect people's perceptions. And so one of the things that they'll do is they'll step in, and then when they see the fact, they'll get the person who's suffering. One spouse is causing difficulties, the other spouse, and the spouse that's suffering that difficulty, they will get that spouse to actually think, to focus on their own suffering rather than on the good of the spouse, right? One of the hallmarks of Our Lady, when she was standing beneath the cross, is that even though it's her son being put to death, and she is seeing the gravity of deicide, and she's seeing how bad men are behaving in relationship to God and putting him to death, and the degree of suffering that she's going through, the fathers of the church say that she was the one comforting the people at the foot of the cross, not them, her. And so even in her own pain, she still was willing to take on the pain or the suffering of other people to comfort them. And I think the same thing has to be said. We have to have that same kind of attitude in our relationships. That we should be gentle and have a certain kind of consideration and seek to help other people rather than trying to just club them over the head when we're in pain. We shouldn't really act out of the pain. Another one is saying injurious words. You know, sometimes in marriage, you'll get this where people are in an argument, and it's always, you see this in certain marriages, it's go for the jugular, right? Try and figure out the most painful, brutal, difficult thing you can say to the individual so that you can kind of top them and kind of have them under control or what have you. And you see this from time to time. Neglect of responsibility towards the children. That's becoming a bigger problem recently. You'll see this. There's certain people that are having children today, and we won't call them the millennials, but that's what they are. And they literally will call their parents and say, would you come take care of my child for a week so we can go on vacation? Really? And you know, it's like my parents grew up. You just, when you became a parent, that meant if you had a vacation, you had to take the kid with you, and you had to go to certain places where you could take kids. Okay. So the demons will kind of drive this, you know, part of it is, too, is this, you know, you deserve a break. Really? You know, the kid isn't getting a break from you. All right. Lack of affection, we've talked a little bit about that. Over-affection. Lack of affection, lack of nurturing. As I've mentioned, demons understand child psychology extraordinarily well. And so what they'll do is they'll drive the difficulties. This goes back to my observation. One of the reasons that demons like us wounded is not just to keep us blocked from our union with God, which is the ultimate reason they want us wounded, but they also want parents wounded, and they want to pick at those wounds, and they want to aggravate those wounds so that the child can't be properly raised, and the child ends up suffering from it so that he ends up wounded, because they want to perpetuate the woundedness in order to keep people from God. Also, part of it is their malice, right? They actually get a certain delight out of causing us physical harm and psychological harm and spiritual damage. They get a delight out of it. Although one time,
one demon said to me, he admitted that, yeah, he gets that sadistic delight when he gets people to fall, using the area of the sixth commandment. He gets that sadistic delight, but he says every time it does it, it increases his shame. Because now he's got yet something else he has to account for. Okay. So putting children in the middle of the argument. So this is one of the things that children will, the demons will say, you should use your children like pawns, right? So that the child becomes the bone of contention. This is why I mentioned before, never arguing in front of the children. In men, driving effeminacy in relationship to their taking headship. Because demons have an absolute loathing of authority, except when they're in charge, then what they do is they will constantly chisel away at that. And one of the ways they will do that is not just by making the wife controlling and become a bit of a battle axe, but they actually do it primarily by driving something that is the result of Adam's sin, which is he just wants peace. So instead of willing to do the hard and arduous and difficult thing and maintain his authority in a rightly ordered way, a lot of times they drive the husband to use his authority in a disordered way. But a lot of times they will drive the husband just to abdicate his authority so that he doesn't have to deal with his wife's chattering, or that things will simply go better. Sometimes today it's just being responsible is difficult, and they just don't want to deal with it anymore. Guys just say, I don't want to bother. Another thing that demons will do is this, and it's based on human psychology in large part. They will drive difficulties in the relationship for a long period of time. They'll actually drive the woman to become more controlling, and then when the guy he's had it, so he just kind of goes to his man cave, then God will give, it's kind of funny, God will give the woman a grace to see the necessity for her own spiritual advancement to subordinate to her husband. I tell women this all the time. If you can master the curse of Eve, if you can master this desire to control and in a rightly ordered and in a virtuous way submit yourself to your husband, once you do that, you will advance very rapidly in perfection. And you can advance very rapidly in perfection through that. If you never master that, you will never master a single virtue. Never. And how do you know this? Modesty. Part of modesty is comportment in your speech. When you're yakking at your husband and trying to control him, that's contrary to modesty. It's contrary to circumspection, keeping track of your surroundings. It's contrary to prudence. It's not helping matters. You're making things worse. It's contrary to fortitude, because part of fortitude is just controlling yourself. It's part of temperance, because why? You want that satisfaction of him doing what you want. It literally destroys all the virtues. But in man, that effeminacy and not being willing to take responsibility and to sacrifice yourself for your wife is the very thing that destroys his ability to advance in virtue. If you can't master those two, you're never going to attain any perfection in any virtue whatsoever. And the demons will pick at the guy to make him effeminate. What is effeminacy? St. Thomas defines it as a putting aside what is arduous in order to pursue what is and to pursue the pleasurable, right? Unwilling to put aside one's pleasure in order to pursue the arduous. So then he says with sloth, which most men have spiritual sloth, he says, he defines it the same way, unwillingness to put aside one's pleasure in order to pursue what's arduous. So then another question he asks is, well, what's the difference? And he says this. He said, effeminacy is an attachment to the pleasure, whereas sloth is an aversion more, the emphasis is more on the aversion to what is difficult and hard. So the demons will pick at people, at men, to get them to just pursue the life of pleasure and peace rather than maintaining the right order. In the end, though, the children pay the price, and so does the wife, ultimately. Demons drive parents to manifest their vices in front of the children. In other words, they get the spouses to be, or the parents to be angry or what have you. Why? Because they know it has a psychological impact on the formation of the child. So if you, every time something happens, you blow your lid, you get angry and use vulgarity, when the kid gets of a certain age, when that same thing happens, what's the associations in his mind? It literally is, well, you get angry and you blow your lid and then you use vulgarity. And then you wonder, well, my kid turned out just like me. Imagine that. All right. Another thing that demons try and do is get people to tolerate bad behavior in their children. It's an arduous thing to be consistent in maintaining discipline with your children. It's difficult. It takes a lot of work and it requires a lot of self-sacrifice and it's a lot of discipline. And so they'll very often, I'm convinced that with some people, this whole business of not wanting to spank their children is just because they don't want to go through the hassle and the pain emotionally of doing it themselves. And you're seeing that more and more today where people see that. But they'll tolerate the bad behavior in the children. Now, every time a child does something wrong, you don't correct it every single time they do it wrong. In fact, in Scripture it says, fathers, don't nag your children lest they lose heart. Okay. So, because why? Because then if you're correcting it every single time, then eventually the kid feels, well, I can't do anything right. But there has to be a consistency and a fairness, right? You also have to not tolerate the temper tantrums. I mentioned the other day, people will bring their 10-year-old boy to us, and he's just completely out of control. And I said, when was the last time you spanked him? Well, we never have. Well, there's your problem. You also see this with children. The demons will drive children to press the buttons of their parents. Children are extremely perspicacious. They know exactly what button to get mom to blow her lid, or exactly what to do to get father to react in a specific way. And so the demons will use that, but this is why the parents can't tolerate it. Another thing is that sometimes people will neglect their duties at home under the guise of actually doing their duty. So, for example, if you look at this battery, it actually says workaholic on it. I saw that that's worth talking about. Sometimes you'll get men who will literally spend all their time at work. Now, sometimes it's a way to escape their wives and their family. But other times they do it in order to, because their ambition is they want a certain level of living, a certain level of lifestyle, and they're unwilling to kind of put that aside and live a slightly lower lifestyle so that they can actually be home. One of the things that the demons will do is they will get people to get their priorities out of whack. They will suggest to the person that, really what you need to do is you need to make this living for your family, right? And they'll even get to the point where you see this with some certain husbands. The wife is doing everything so that the husband can work. Now, there's a certain sense when that has to be done to some degree in order to financially survive. But the demons will try and get the guys to think that really the family and everybody is there for their career, for their work, rather than the other way around. The work is there for the family. And you see this with guys who are extremely ambitious. They start neglecting their family because of and they start seeing the achieving of this success as an end in itself, rather than seeing it as achieving the success for the sake of being able to survive for the family. On the other hand, you'll also get people just to want to deny their state in life. More than once, women who have come to me, they've been married for 30-some years, usually 20 to 30 years. They might have anywhere from 7 to 9 children, and they'll tell me, say, Father, I've been discerning my vocation, and I think I'm supposed to be a nun. Really? And they said, yes, because I keep getting these feelings that I want to be alone and pray with God. So when you tell them, demons can give you inspirations to do spiritual works as long as it's going to be contrary to your spiritual well-being, and they kind of give you this pale look. And so when you have to tell them, no, God's will for you is you go home and take care of your children and your husband, right? So you'll see that from time to time. The other thing is, too, is you'll get these guys that spend all their time in recreation and doing every other thing other than taking care of their family. But it's always kind of a chiseling away at people, at least in relationship to their state in life, trying to get that. And that's not even true just about marriage. It's true even about the priesthood and things like that. But they're always trying to get people to neglect those things that pertain to marriage. I'm going to stop there because I suspect people have some questions. And you can ask your questions. Yes?
You've given us a lot of information. I know you have some books. What do you suggest for the newbie person who's just getting better on meditation? Do you have any books for that, or prayers for your healing?
If you're just starting out, I don't recommend anything I've written. So, although actually the sermons are probably okay. Those are probably okay. If you're really starting out with your faith and you're really trying to get the depth of your faith, and even in stuff in relationship to marriage, one of the best books out there is called The Catechism Explained by Spirago. And basically what it is it's an extended commentary on the Catechism of the Council of Trent. It's one of the most fantastic catechisms that's ever been written. So it's really good because you can actually go into various facets, and even in marriage, or the sacrament of marriage and things of that sort. So that's kind of where I would start. If you're looking for prayer books, the two that I would probably recommend right off the bat is, I think they republished it. It's just called The Manual of Prayers from the Third Council of Baltimore. It's a really good prayer book that you can start praying, and it even has stuff for wives and husbands, etc. If you're looking to deal with stuff that has to do with the spiritual warfare, you can buy the book that I just put out called Deliverance Prayers for the Laity. So the getting the imprimatur seems to take extraordinarily long these days.
What is the first word?
Deliverance Prayers for the Laity. Because those are all prayers that the general consensus among the exorcists is that these are general prayers that lay people can actually make use of. In some of those prayers, people complain that, these came from the Protestants. Actually, they didn't. So, for example, the binding prayers. Most people don't know that binding prayers, if you actually look, there's 4 times in Scripture where they talk about binding of demons. There's 6 times binding of demons is mentioned in the Manual of Exorcism of 1617. There's 2 times it's mentioned in the Solemn Rite of Exorcism, and 1 time it's mentioned in chapter 3. The binding of demons is a very common thing in the history of the Catholic Church. Just the Protestants happen to rediscover it. But it's the real question is, who has the authority to do it, and how do you do it? And that's why the book might be a little bit helpful, because I talk about when you cannot do it based upon the theology of the Church and what the exorcists have noticed through experience, which is not just mine, it's actually other exorcists. And then also what who can do it, and then how to do it. Because a lot of it is that people end up biting off more than they can chew. So in there, that would be helpful for people to learn, especially because a lot of those prayers can be very helpful in marriage. Prayers for healing, there's also prayers for healing in there, which are really helpful for people who have been wounded sometime in their past or even within their marriage. Okay. Yes?
How can a Catholic be possessed if they are filled with the Holy Spirit? Would that preclude them from being possessed by a demon?
No, because possession is in the body. Grace, which is the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, is in the soul. So a person can actually be possessed and still be in the state of grace. And actually, some of the holiest people I've met were people who were possessed, ironically. Yes?
So can you just repeat the titles of the 3 books? Can you just repeat the titles of the 3 books?
The Catechism Explained by Spirago, and then the Manual of Prayers from the Third Council of Baltimore, and then also Deliverance Prayers for the Laity. I think all of those are available on Amazon. Of course, Amazon is this monster. A friend of mine has come up with an acronym: Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. So and he calls it FANG, right? So, anyway, okay. Any other questions? Yes. Yes.
I know you mentioned that the precious blood of Christ is very powerful against the diabolical.
Right.
So I just want to know, why is it it not given to us in the Latin Mass?
The primary reason has to do with the danger of sacrilege, in the sense that it could easily be spilled and lost. And actually, that's one of the reasons why a lot of dioceses are getting away from it. So historically, that's the actual reason. That's part of the reason. The second reason is the Church condemned the proposition that you actually have to receive it under the species of wine in order to receive the full Christ. So historically, one of the reasons they restricted it just to the host is because in the host is the body and blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. And so, in order to avoid this idea that you have to, because the Protestants started this in the very beginning, that if you don't receive it under the species of wine, you're not receiving the blood of Christ. Actually, you are in the host. You're receiving the whole Christ. So that was one of the reasons, too, why the Church said no to it. So, yeah.
In being submissive to your husband, how do you do that?
Okay. You stand there with a rolling pin, smacking it in your hand. It comes in a few ways. The first is by recognizing his legitimate authority and not usurping his authority. In other words, letting him make the decisions, giving him your counsel and letting him make the decisions. The second is developing the virtue of piety. Piety is, take that back, dulia. It's technically dulia. Dulia is the virtue in which we have honor for those who are above us. Piety is specifically for our parents. But if you have the virtue of dulia, basically what it is that you should have a certain reverence and appreciation and respect for the authority that God has given him, not because of him, but because God has given it to him. And so developing that appreciation and respect for the authority will go a long ways to help you do that. The second thing is always observe modesty. St. Thomas says, when I went to my spiritual director after I finished my last book, which just came out 2 days ago, but I told them, I said, which book should I work on next? My spiritual director, I said, I really want to do the one on modesty. He says, no, you don't. Because he knew I kept putting off the book on how demons influence us because the notes alone are like 400 pages. So he's like, no, you've got to write that book because that's your vocation. You need to write that. But in this modesty book that I'm working on, I've already got the notes pretty much ready for it. St. Thomas talks about there's a sub-virtue to modesty, and he calls it stability to authority. Equality to a stable authority. And what that means is that your behavior in relationship to an authority should always fit the authority that the person has. And so what that basically means is because your husband is your head, by the way, his headship, I'll talk about that in just a minute, but that there should be a certain modesty in any time you talk with him or engage with him so that respect is properly shown. And that's something that you need to teach the children, that there needs to be this respect in relationship to it. When I grew up, if in fact I actually saw my 16-year-old sister get spanked by my father once because she called my mom a derogatory term, and my dad said, and so that was it. Right? In other words, you have to make sure that anytime you're approaching him, that you're doing it in a way that shows respect for his office as the head of the household. His office is there to provide and to protect. So developing a gratitude and appreciation for the protection and for the providence that your husband is providing for you will also help. But it primarily has to do with respecting the authority by not countermanding him unless there's grave cause, or at least waiting until the time is opportune to discuss something with him and offer him your counsel and then leaving it alone and not holding on to it and not trying to drive it. Above all, trying not to control him. So that's just kind of the beginnings of it. Yes?
Are the world, the flesh, and the devil kind of equal influences, or are the flesh and the world really guided and used by the personal demons, and how does that relate to the concupiscence of the flesh,
right,
concupiscence of the eyes, and the pride of life?
Well, actually, you just said those three correlate to the three forms of temptation. The world, the flesh, and the devil, they all hinge on the flesh, which is concupiscence. So they all hinge on that. So they all actually So the demons can't tempt us unless it's somehow it's going to give us something in the flesh, or acts upon the flesh, or they can act upon the flesh, and the world acts upon the flesh, and the demons use the world in order to act upon the flesh. So it all hinges around the flesh. So it's really a matter of destroying concupiscence. It's really a matter of destroying the concupiscence, which is this tendency, or it's a disordination, a disorder of the appetites or the lower faculties towards pleasure. And so that's the one thing that has to be crushed in the process of conquering all temptation. This is one of the reasons why the demons have a particular aversion to two kinds of people who pray a lot and people who fast a lot. The reason being is because through the fasting you get your body under control. So if he tries to tempt you, you're much more sensitive to it. Because as many of you have probably noticed, if you fast for any length of time, after a while your body becomes much more acute. In fact, when you indulge too much, your senses become dulled, right? So then, but they also don't like prayer, because in prayer you're filling your mind with God, and so when something contrary comes into that, you're much more quick to react. And so prayer and fasting are two of the principal ways in which you crush that. Obviously pride, every demon fell out of pride. They all wanted something above their state. So, but anyway, that's actually those. Actually, that'd be a good conference for me to do at some point on the threefold eyes. That'd be good. Yes.
Well, what's the best way that you recommend for men to stop being so effeminate and become more masculine?
I think that there's several things. The principal thing is, if you're married, start assuming responsibility for your family, for your wife. Start praying more often. Start doing the things that are difficult on a spiritual level. But in taking care of your wife, realize your authority is not for you, it's for her. What most people don't seem to realize is that, especially because things are so disordered today, when you get into a position of authority, the actual office or the authority is actually for the benefit of those underneath you, not for the one who has it. So as long as you're using your authority for the well-being of your wife and your children, but I think it's taking responsibility. So if you look at what did God actually do to Adam? He said, because you've done this, you will work all the days of your life. In other words, now you got to support her. You have to take responsibility for her in thorns, right? And by the sweat of your brow. So now basically what's going to happen is he did exactly what countermands effeminacy in men. Suffering and responsibility. That's what Fulton Sheen said. We mature by suffering and responsibility. And so this is what guys have to engage in. They have to engage in stuff that's physically and arduously difficult, that's spiritually difficult, like prayer, fasting, working on chastity, things of that sort. But then they also have to take the responsibility, and don't abnegate the responsibility, and be willing to suffer those things in relationship to it. Part of the suffering part is also that willingness to sacrifice. And that's the thing that most guys don't seem to understand. Women will submit if they see that the husband is sacrificing for her. He's willing to put himself aside for her. But the minute she sees he's selfish, she's not going to submit, and that's just part of human nature. On the other hand, women have to understand that if she submits, the guy will have this inclination to want to love her and to sacrifice for her. And so that's the thing that they have to do. St. Paul says, love your wives, which means what? Will good for them despite how you feel, ultimately. Yes. Yeah.
What are some things that can be done to repair damage that may have occurred in your family due to either demonic influence of some sort, or poor decisions that maybe perhaps you have made in regard to that influence?
In spiritual warfare, you've heard me say this, spiritual warfare, precision is everything. So you need to know what the nature of the diabolic influence, if it's there. You need to know if it's there, because sometimes it can just be psychological and it's just caused a lot of emotional damage. But you need to know whether there's even something, whether there's a natural explanation or whether there's a diabolic or both. But you need to know the nature of the diabolic influence. And this is why I tell people, pray to Our Lady of Sorrows to reveal to you what's the nature of this demon I'm dealing with. And then from there, if it's like a demon of fear or anger or depression or whatever the case is, then you start working on the virtues contrary to that, and then there's some prayers you can say to combat him. If it's something that is significant, like somebody engaged in satanic worship or something like that, and as a result of that, now we've got this thing in our family, I would say you need to see a priest or an exorcist. But usually I tell people to just start yourself with, praying, doing those things, receiving the sacraments, praying regularly, doing all those things to become a good Catholic, etc., making use of the sacramentals, but then also saying the prayers to Our Lady. And once you find out what the specificity of him is, then you can start doing the virtues contrary to that. So it's really about knowledge. To correct a problem, you got to know what the problem is, and so you just have to ask Our Lady, reveal to me what the problem is. And then from there, you can then talk to a priest about, okay, how do we repair the damage? Yes, because there's so many different kinds of ways that demons can damage family life. Yeah.
So we have guardian angels who are specific to us.
Yes.
Is there a corollary on the demonic side where there are particular demons that are attached or are drawn to us, or is it they kind of shuffle through?
All of the above. In other words, in the sense that there's some discussion, and it doesn't seem to have some support from the hierarchy, but there's not. I haven't seen. Someone said, no, the church condemned that, and I said, well, could you provide me the information? He never could. But that basically, some think that Satan, in looking at you to mock God, he assigns a guardian demon to your life. But I think that's a bit of a stretch because of the fact that some people have what we call a familiar that's just from the time they're born, they seem to have something. What I tend to think is that they look at your disposition, and then the demon that tends to, that the sin that you're most likely to be inclined to because of your disposition, he tends to be the guy to show up to tempt you from time to time and try and get his foot in your life. That would probably be more my read on it than anything else. Although once in a while the demons will, there is somebody that Satan has assigned a demon to afflict somebody, but that's a case-by-case basis. So, yes?
What are your thoughts on the recent translation of the exorcism rite into English, both the intent behind it and how efficacious do you think it'll be compared to the last one?
Ironically, I have a slightly more benign position to it than most. It's a qualified benign position in relationship to it. First of all, as you probably know, the people that wrote the new rite of exorcism, none of them were experienced exorcists. And you can tell it. When you read through this, you're like, what? You're not going to do that then. Like, for example, you'll start out the ritual, then all of a sudden you stop and you have the celebration of the blessing of water. Excuse me, the thing's sticking to the ceiling. I don't think we have time for that. I mean, you're just like, who comes up with this? The other thing is, too, is they call the new rite of exorcism a celebration. Let me get this straight. Torturing an intelligent creature to the point where his pain is so extreme that he would rather give you information and end up back in hell than go through what he's going through. You're going to call that a celebration? That's sick. Right? I mean, it's the same thing of calling the Mass a celebration. The Mass is a celebration. It's a sacrifice. We're commemorating putting Christ to death. Right? So there's this misnomer in relationship to it. The other thing is that they reduced several things in it, which was a disaster. They removed numerous things that were diagnostic in nature. So, for example, there's one part in chapter 2, which is the solemn rite of exorcism in the old rite, where you just start naming various facets of Satan: the inciter of incest, the cause of discord. You just go down all these things that this guy does, and when the demon pings off of that, then you know there's something about this that's going to help you. They removed all of that stuff. They don't even call, they say, well, you're not supposed to call demons names. You're not calling them names. You are enumerating his titles, his defects. The other side of it is they removed most of the actual commanded adjurations. So, in the old rite, it's literally, I command you to this, I command you to that, I command you to this, I command you to that. In the new rite, you might do that once or twice. So it's really anemic. However, about 1 out of 100 demons actually reacts more to deprecatory prayers than imprecatory prayers. Now, deprecatory prayers are when you petition God for something, and in that particular case, it might be useful. I've never found it, but it might be useful. The second component is that it might be, so it might be useful in 1 in 100 cases, but most of the time it's not. The other thing is translating it into English, I think, is a mistake. Now, I know why they're doing it. They're doing it because of the fact that most priests, even the ones that I train, out of the 50 that we're training now, probably only 5 know Latin well enough to be able to actually make their way through the ritual. And so, a lot of times, they wanted this thing to be translated in English. Here's the problem. They put out a version in 1999. Didn't work. So then they put out another version, I think it was 2001. Now they're talking about putting out yet another edition. And my basic attitude is, look, you're obviously not getting the point. How is a committee stretched over a year and a half, which I think is all the time they spent on it, or something like that, maybe it's 3 years. How is a committee in 3 years going to derive a ritual that is as efficacious as one that was fashioned over 20 centuries by extraordinarily experienced exorcists and saints? That is just gross hubris to think you're going to do that. So just put the thing aside. My theory is to add a chapter 4. Although, ironically, we call chapter 4, well, we need to do chapter 4. That's when you think someone's faking and you just read something about, how the Grinch stole Christmas in Latin to see if they react. But as a diagnostic tool. But the point is that they could have just added some prayers in the back, like to Our Lady or things of that sort, or incorporated some of the rites of exorcism, like the one that I put out in the manual of the minor exorcisms, which priests can use. They could have incorporated some of that stuff, especially the stuff on marriage, and there's an exorcism, Coram Sanctissima, which is extraordinarily effective. They could have added stuff like that, but instead they decided they were going to come up with it. Now, part of it has to do with, and if you've listened to my conferences, you know I kind of rant about this a little bit, and then I want to talk a little bit about Latin. The part of it has to do with, I hate to say this, but the Greatest Generation was one of the worst generations in the history of this planet. Think about it. They went from a church that was at its spiritual, moral, and financial peak, prime, at least in this country. And within their one generation, they handed us a church that is financially, spiritually, and morally bankrupt. They were the ones that got rid of all the discipline. They were the ones who swept aside the entire tradition and revamped literally everything. They literally could not keep their hands off of anything that the church's patrimony was offering. And so the rite of exorcism was the last thing. And so that's why they literally cannot leave it alone. That is a sign of moral depravity. I'm sorry. The point being is that they just couldn't leave the thing alone. Back to the Latin. Why put it in English? Well, I don't even know why they're translating this particular version in English, because they're just about to come out with another one in Latin, and they're going to have to translate that one again. But the other point of it is that the demons Latin is a sacred language. Everybody's got this idea that languages are sacred because they occur in Scripture. That's actually not true. If you actually look at the fathers of the church, they say they're three sacred languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Not because they occur in Scripture, but because they occur as the languages affixed to the instrument of our salvation, the cross. That's what makes them sacred. And so the demons consider Latin sacred, not only because of that, but because it's the language of the mystical body of Christ, the church. And they consider even the pronunciation sacred. They don't even want to do that. So I think and which basically means you reduce the efficacy of the prayer in that process, which I think is a mistake. And a lot of exorcists, or not a lot, because there's not that many exorcists that use the new rite of exorcism, because they've all, so numerous guys have tried it, and they've even just looked at it, and they just said this thing ain't working, so they just go back to the old one anyway. So, yes.
You have given us many beautiful teachings on God's role for men and women. And how would you counsel families where one of the spouses are abusive alcoholics, where being able to celebrate the role of women to men would be very difficult?
Right, that's correct.
The submission to the husband is based upon, well, the authority, let me back up. The authority of the husband as the head of the household is based on a natural law of right, which means it's circumscribed and conditioned by the natural law. So if there are abuses or things that are occurring, by abuses I don't mean minor ones, because guys are always going to do stupid things. But if you're talking about grave abuses or things of that sort, then the actual right to make use of that authority is suspended, and the wife will actually have to take the place of those things that he's abnegating, not all of them. That's what the moralists say. But then as soon as he gets his act together, then his right to exercise that authority resumes. If you're talking about things like alcoholism and things like that, it's the same. The principle is basically, as a matter of charity, you should still pray for them and to do what you can for them and to help them to see the problem and help them to get through it so that they can resume their duties in relationship to that. So it's really about the family coming together, and that may require that, like in the case of if the husband's an alcoholic or something like that, or abusive, the wife may have to help the children to learn to moderate their suffering and their pain in relationship to him and be able to pray for him so that he changes so that it's not painful anymore. So, yes.
Wow, thank you, Father. My wife's been elbowing me the whole night.
See what you're doing wrong?
Yes.
See what you're doing wrong?
First of all, Father, thank you. You're such a blessing. You've given us so much information. I'm your new #1 fan. So I got 2 questions.
Sure.
The first one is, can a layperson pray the long-form Pope Leo XIII prayer for himself in the privacy of his home?
Okay. Yeah. When that was first published in 1897, I think is the year, it was published in the Act Apostolic Sedes, Leo XIII said that any layman can use this. That was the understanding. The prayer was then modified and then republished, I think, in 1928. Don't quote me on the dates. That former version is now forbidden use to everyone. The current version, which you see in the Rituale Romanum of 1962, is the one that only priests can use, and the Pontifical Commission Ecclesiae Dei, in conjunction also with the CDF. So the CDF came out in 1985 and said that that lay people were forbidden the use of that prayer entirely. So they can't pray a part of it, not even privately, nothing. They said, then the PCD came out and said that the priests can only use it publicly when they have permission of the local ordinary, but they are permitted to say it as a private prayer. So that's where it stands right now, according to legislation of the church. And part of this is that you'll see this because there are lay people who are saying it. In fact, there's websites who encourage people to say it because they won't accept the fact that the CDF said, no, this is actually restricted to clergy. And it was restricted to clergy not just in 1985. It was restricted to clergy a long time ago, that only a bishop or a priest with the permission of his ordinary could say this prayer publicly. So that restriction has been around for a while, but they don't want to accept it. But the difficulty is that's why those people show up on my doorstep from time to time, because they're being retaliated against, because they're doing something they don't have the authority to do. So.
Second question is the newer rite of exorcism given in 1998 as effective as the older rite of exorcism from the 1614 AD?
Not my experience. Now, again, you're always going to have some demon that just doesn't fit the pattern. And so it might work more with him. But generally speaking, exorcists, even new rite exorcists, say no, the old one is just much more effective, just in our experience. And part of it is that the one, chapter 2 is actually a codification, or it's a codification of one that had been around for a while and one modified. That there were various forms of it before then, and so when it was finally codified, it kind of became fixed after that. But there were various forms of it, so that this thing has been around in various forms for at least 17 to 1800 years. So. And definitively, at least since the time of Gregory the Great, but there's precursors before that, and so it has a kind of a patrimony and a lineage. The other thing is demons have perfect memory, so every time you say that over them, they remember some saint who beat them over the head with that same thing, right? And so they're much more sensitive to this thing because it's just been around a while. You know, if somebody beat you and they were always beating you with a particular stick, and then one day they put out another stick and they took a beating, which stick are you going to have the less affection for? It's going to be the one that they beat you the most with. And I think that's part of this equation too. So, yes.
Two very brief questions. First, why did you get rid of the minor orders and major orders? And especially the minor order of exorcists, what was it exactly, and why was it being exorcist?
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, let's just answer that first, and then you can ask your second question. Historically, the minor orders, according to the theology and the history of the church, basically what happened is that all of the minor orders and the major orders are contained in the episcopate, or at least in the depending on the debate on which side of the debate, but it's contained in the priesthood. When they decided to make deacons, they basically took out those sections that were already contained in it. Then later, right after the time of the apostles, there's an unpacking over about a course of 200 years, if I understand the history correct, although I'm open to correction, that they unpacked the remaining of these. They removed them out and separated them out, all the minor orders. And the minor orders are a gradation in order to become a priest. But historically, though, the minor orders also could stand on their own. So you actually had exorcists up until just a little bit before Trent. That basically the exorcists were given, depending on the bishop's permission, exorcists who had the minor order of exorcists could actually perform solemn exorcisms over people without being a priest. Later, it gets merged after Trent with the priesthood, and that's it. They can't. It becomes what they call a potesta. It's not a potesta legata. It's a potest restricta. It's a restricted power. Well, because even deacons can use it when they baptize. So, but it's a restricted power, and so as a result of that, whereas a potest legata means that you can't use it, period. So, but the point is that being a restricted power, then what happened is Paul VI comes along and pretty much wipes out, it just says, no, the minor orders, we're not going to confer them anymore. But the interesting thing of it is that there's a couple of components to this which are really disastrous. In the old rite, and when you receive tonsure, which is the order of making a cleric, in that tonsure, you're actually taking on a change of state in life. So you're going from a layman to a cleric, right? At least that's the discussion. Now, where that stands right now, because the whole canonical question of what a cleric is another matter. But the point being is that historically that meant that when you were in the seminary and you're there for a little while and you could demonstrate that you could live chastely, because that's what you need to do to be a cleric, once you became a cleric you had to change of state, and that meant you were receiving the grace of state, to be chaste. That meant that a guy, after his first year in the seminary, had 7 years where he was using the grace of state to remain chaste. They removed that entirely. Now you not become a cleric until you're a deacon. So you basically have guys living in a seminary for 6-7 years without the grace of state. That's absurd. The second point, plus then you receive the graces that go along with becoming minor orders. Now the Vatican itself has said the minor orders and the ministries are not the same thing. The orders are an office, the ministries are a permission to do those things, two different things. So it's something the church is going to revive. It's going to have to, because I think that's what God wants. Your second question is?
My second question is just about the things of music, because you know that music affects our appetite, affects our imagination.
Right.
So I just feel that music is one of those things that not very much discuss Catholic groups in general.
It's not what, I'm sorry?
We don't discuss how evil music can be, or powerful it is.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole lecture. Well, I think you kind of said it. Different kinds of music play on different faculties. So you have some music that plays on the concupiscible appetite, and so it drives people to concupiscence. And then other kinds of music plays on the irascible appetite. We know that with acid rock music and things of that sort. Chant actually appeals, I think, more to the intellect and will, and then classical music appeals to the intellect. The problem is that because of original sin, we have antecedent appetites. These appetites are basically out of control. And one of the things is that when you listen to music in an unmitigated way, two things arise. One, you get a pleasure out of the music, and so guys become effeminate if they listen to it too much, especially the stuff that's very concupiscible in nature. The second component is it just aggravates the antecedent appetites if it's not properly moderated. And how do you know this? Take a teenager who's listening to music all the time and tell them to turn the music off, and what kind of response do you get? They just lose it on you emotionally, right? Well, and this is saying, and that tells you that there's some kind of emotional attachment, but that means it can also be deleterious to our spiritual lives. Socrates he was one of the very first ones to talk about the fact that different kinds of music cause different dispositional changes as us, and actually cause us to have different kind of emotions and inclinations and moods, etc., and that they would actually, this is why they would have different kinds of bands or certain kinds of instruments that would play when going into battle, as opposed to what you're going to have your candlelight dinner at. Although maybe some people do that too. But the point being is that it can have a spiritual impact on us, and I think that's something that is something that's very important. I talk a bit about it in my book on psychology. I also talk about it in this book I just came out with called The Principle of the Integral Good, where I talk about how music can be evil or bad if one aspect of it is disordered. And so if you want to know what that means, you can buy the book. All right. Yeah.
You have the right to pray and wife, bind demons.
One more time.
As a husband, you have the right to bind a demon on your wife and children.
Yeah, if you look at the actual structure of the natural law, because you're authority, it basically comes down to this. The ability to command the demon to leave is determined upon your ability to command someone in relationship to that thing. So, the fact that as a father you can command your children to do something means that you can command demons in relationship to them. You can't do that with your godson, right? You can't command your godson, come over and mow my lawn. He's not bound to that. Same with grandparents. Grandparents can't command their grandson, come over here and mow my lawn. Now, he might do it out of piety, but he's not bound to it. It's only the parents that can bind. And it's the same thing with the husband in relationship with the wife, and the wife in relationship with the kids. So it's based upon that ability to command in relationship to the thing, because authority is the right of determination of the disposition of the thing. That's its definition. And so that means that if the demons incur on it, if you have legitimate authority over them, you have the right to command them to leave. But if you don't, and you command them to leave, they know you don't, and then you have no protection, because God will protect the person who uses their authority in a rightly ordered way. So, okay, yes. Yeah.
Okay, question. So you said that the diabolic attack your imagination, but what about your dreams?
Oh yeah. Well, dreaming is actually a product of the imagination, memory, and the cogitative power. So yes, they can. Although as a general rule, I tell people just ignore your dreams. And I know we'll end here because it's time for exposition, and then I'm going to go sit in the confessional, but until about 9 o'clock. But the demons, the characteristic of demons is the cause is always some way in the effect. So if you're dreaming, the actual quality, not the content so much, but the quality of the dream will actually tell you a little bit of something about the demon. But it's too hard to discern properly. And so the church has always said, just ignore it entirely. But the two qualities of diabolic dreams that is pretty consistent is it will be extraordinarily lucid, almost like it's real, very colorful, very vivid. The second is it will be very logical and follow an arc, like a movie, right? And so if it lacks those two, in other words, if our normal dreaming patterns are just mental garbage, and so they're kind of all over the map, they're not very clear, it's generally speaking, etc. Whereas when the demons get involved. But on the other hand, it's kind of hard to tell that dividing line. So that's why the church has always said, and the saints have always said, just ignore it. Any type of dreaming you have, you just get up and you move about your business. If you think you're being affected with demons, there's in my book that I did. There's a prayer to commit. There's called Commission of Body and Soul, which you can say before you go to bed. The other one, which I started using myself one time, this demon was kind of agitating me because I was working on this one case, and so it just dawned on me. My job is to be the instrument of justice to this guy. So I just turned to Christ and I said, every time he does this, start punishing him for it. And I fell asleep and slept like a baby after that one. So, But you can try that. It's called the punishing prayer, which is in there. You can try that as well. Okay. If you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et manet semper. Amen.